battle in the heart of Alabama caught our attention. Coal miners in one community, they've been on strike now for months.
Working as long as 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, in some of the most dangerous conditions.
I really think that the labor movement is the single greatest force for democracy in the history of the United States.
The story of Alabama is a story of not just resilience, but of militancy.
I say no contract, you say no code. No contract, no contract.
If we ain't all free, ain't none of us free.
You're listening to Alabama's only union talk radio show, The Valley Labor Report, with Adam Keller and Jacob Morrison.
This is going to be a Unions 101. We're not talking about any news today. We want, and this is a show, this is an episode that we do every now and then, maybe a couple times a year, because there is so little understanding of unions in this country, of how workers can come together and make their lives better, make their jobs better, make their life better for their families and their communities. I think that's possibly by design, but nevertheless, a lot of folks, they're going to come out of high school, they're not even going to be able to tell you what a union is, what it does. So we are going to get down to the basics. What is a union? How do I form one? Why are they good? What is a worker even? What is organizing? What do we mean by that? We're going to get to all of that and more, and that's all we're going to do on the show today, folks. 90 minutes of just what is unions? What is unions? That's all we're talking about today. So like I said in the intro, we have a fantastic panel assembled here today, and so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pass the mic. We're going to go around the horn, let everybody introduce themselves, tell us their name, their union, and why they're active in the labor movement. Why is it that because all of these folks, they have, maybe devoting their life to the labor movement, maybe a bit of an overstatement, but a good amount of all of these people, all of their time is taken up by advocating for their coworkers and for themselves on and off the job, and for other people. So we're going to go around the horn. Everybody's going to take a couple of minutes to introduce themselves. Let's start off with Lee Diaz.
Hi, everybody. My name is Lee Diaz. My full name is Leandra, but everybody calls me Lee. I go by she, her pronouns, and I'm a graduate worker at New York University. And I've been a worker with the Graduate Student Organizing Committee, which we abbreviate as GSOC, for almost 6 years now, since starting a PhD in American Studies. This is part of UAW Local 2110. I was recently a delegate to the UAW Constitutional Convention, and am part of Unite All Workers for Democracy, which is a reform caucus of the UAW. And in addition to that, I'm also, like I said, getting a PhD in American Studies, and I study how capital moves, but people don't. I got involved with the labor movement because I had a health scare 2 or 3 years ago. I knew when I got to grad school that I was going to be in a union. Like, I knew that they were good in theory, like it was good in my politics, but I never saw myself as an organizer or a leader in the labor movement until I got sick. And it became clear when I was trying to get healthcare for Crohn's disease, which is an autoimmune disease, that the only people who were sticking up for me were my union. It wasn't the university. It wasn't my employer. A lot of times my doctor's hands were tied, and it sure as hell wasn't the insurance company. And so when I got better, I realized that this was something that was super important, because even if I, as someone who's like highly credentialed, highly educated, basically getting a PhD in bureaucracy, had difficulty navigating the healthcare landscape and difficulty like engaging with my employer, then so many people must too. And so now I like organize full time. Yeah. So excited to be here.
Fantastic. And for longtime and critical listeners of the show, you will know that Lee Diaz has been on the program before. She is a return guest. We talked to her after the New York Union grad students went on strike a couple of years ago. So that was a good episode, and they were able to win, what was it, a 40% raise or something insane?
Yeah, over the course of the 15 years between 2015 and 2030, we'll have increased our hourly wage by 200%. And
Wild.
we went from $20 an hour to $26.50 in the first year of our contract.
That's awesome. That's fantastic. All right, so let's just go around the screen. Johnny.
Hi, my name is Johnny Lane. I'm a Delta flight attendant. I've been a flight attendant for almost 15 years with Delta, so long career. I got started organizing our union at Delta after I had a really bad year. You all just know it's just one of those years where everything goes wrong. My car was stolen. We had a family emergency with my sister. She had a stillborn baby. And then my mom had a mild heart attack scare. It was just awful. So I did have some absences on my record, and those were it. And my manager called me in and was like, hey, what's up with your reliability? Well, we're going to have to put you on, some sort of, we call it probation, like being back on like a disciplinary action. I'm like, you know what? I had all these tragedies. Where's the compassion? Where's the gray area that people usually talk about? Well, our company talks about in terms of not having a union. The gray area is a benefit. They could be understanding. They could do you favors. And so in that moment, it seemed like none of that was happening. So I was like, okay, something is wrong here. Something isn't adding up. It's not matching with what they're telling me. And so then my friend, who some of you have met, Christina Simonin, she had started becoming more active with unionizing in the workplace. And she called me and was like, hey, Johnny, let's meet up. We had our first one-on-one, and it didn't take much to convince me to start organizing with her. So we've been organizing with AFA, Association of Flight Attendants, led by Sarah Nelson, for close to 6 years now. It's been a while, and that may seem like it's not successful, but for an airline our size, where our work group, we have close to 23,000 flight attendants. And so in order for us to even trigger a vote for a union, we have to get close to 11 to 12,000 flight attendants to sign authorization cards. It is a monumental task. And by the time we're done, it will be the largest organizing effort in modern labor history for one closed shop. So we're doing a big thing here, and it's taking a while, but we're getting there piece by piece. And we're inspired by so many of you who are organizing in the work that you're doing: Starbucks, Amazon, REI, just every day. So you're keeping us going. So we thank you for that inspiration and the hard work that you all are doing. And we're just glad to be a part of this movement. We're glad that you guys are welcoming us into the labor movement. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Couldn't be more happy to see anybody and everybody unionizing. So it's good to see that, and I'm glad to have you. Hayden.
I'm Hayden Wright. So I'm with the UMWA, which is United Mine Workers of America, and I'm associated with Locals 2245 and 2368 as the auxiliary president. We've actually been on strike for 18 months. So for us, it's a little bit different. We're not just doing new organizing, we're also fighting a huge fight against we've been on strike against. So a lot of the organizing we've been doing is actually bringing other parts of the labor movement and getting them involved in the strike action that's happening here with us. And we've seen huge turnouts and huge outreach from Sarah Nelson, from Liz Schuler, from the steel workers that have come from all over the country to come down and show support. So just keeping the message out there when you have a big fight like that going on. And we're not looking at a tentative agreement right now. We're still on strike, and we could still use that support and solidarity. And you only gain that through a union. So it's us on strike here is 900, but we've had 6 million brothers and sisters that have had our back for 18 months. So that is one big reason why unions are so important, because you're not alone. Hearing your stories, it was the union that kept you from fighting those battles alone. That's why everyone deserves that opportunity. And I'm so excited to be here with all of you and to hear your stories.
Absolutely. Graham?
Hi. I can't even express how honored and excited I am to be here in the presence of such incredible organizers. I guess I'll introduce myself. I'm Graham. My pronouns are they, them. I work at REI in New York City. We recently unionized in March and are beginning our contract negotiations. So starting to get our first contract on paper. I'm part of the bargaining committee. So I'm actually sitting at the table with a group of my coworkers, hashing it out with our employer to get, fair wages, fair working conditions. And I became active in the labor movement just because I was seeing a lot of injustice and mistreatment of myself and my coworkers, especially coming back to work after the pandemic. People's safety was not being respected. Their general humanity wasn't being respected and continues to be disrespected. So yeah, I came for the workplace kind of organizing, but I'm staying for the amazing national effort that is happening right now. So yeah, it is a huge honor to be here, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being willing to take the time, Graham. And last but certainly not least, Michelle Eisen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm going to echo what Graham said. To be in the presence of such strong, amazing organizers in this current labor movement climate in our country is really phenomenal. I'm a Starbucks barista here in Buffalo, New York. I started with the company in August of 2010, so just past my 12-year anniversary. And what brought me to Starbucks to begin with is I'm a production stage manager. I've been working in the local professional theater scene since college, but that doesn't come with health benefits. So I was looking for a part-time job that was flexible, that would allow me to have health benefits, and that was where Starbucks came in. That was their deal. That's who they professed to be. I'd been a longtime Starbucks customer, and I knew they had a reputation for how they treated their employees, and I knew how I was treated as a customer, so this seemed like a perfect fit. And I think the early part of my time with the company, they did live up to those professed values that they have. They say they're a progressive company and they care about their employees and the community and the environment. But then things started to slip, and it was a really clear shift in the company sort of policy when it came to what we're calling profits over partners. Starbucks calls their employees partners, it was coined because we're all given stock in the company. But it's since been used as a really manipulative term to make us think that those of us on the floors of these cafes, the hourly workers, are somehow have an equal stake or an equal say in the company as, upper management and corporate, which is just simply not the case. And I got involved in the organizing campaign here in Buffalo right at the beginning where it started, not because I knew what I was doing or I knew necessarily what was going to come of it, but because I had already made the decision in spring of 2021 to leave the company. We had worked through the bulk of the pandemic. We were not taken care of. A lot of what Graham is saying, I'm echoing. This is a multi-billion-dollar, multinational corporation, and they were simply not taking care of us at a time when they A, should have been, and B, absolutely could have been. On top of that, you had a company like Starbucks on all of these financial shows with the CEO boasting record-breaking profits in the middle of the pandemic. Not just regular profits, record-breaking profits. And we've got full-time workers in these shops that can't pay their rent or get groceries based on what this company is paying us. And on top of that, we're in the middle of a global pandemic where we're putting our lives and our families' lives at risk every single day. So I was going to be done. I was feeling incredibly undervalued. And then a couple months after I'd made the decision to sort of start the process of leaving the company, a coworker asked me what I thought about the potential of Starbucks unionizing, to which I said I had never thought about that. I didn't know a ton about it. My father and my grandfather were in unions growing up, and I knew that our health benefits were really great because of it. And I knew that it was generally a good thing, but I didn't know a lot about service industry unions. It's just not something you hear all that much about. It's a very notoriously difficult industry to unionize to begin with. I certainly didn't know much about coffee shop unions. There had been a local coffee shop here in Buffalo called Spot Coffee that had managed to unionize in the summer of 2019. And that kind of put the bug in everybody's ear that maybe, but then there was a pandemic. So those conversations came to a close. But all of a sudden here it was, and it sounded like the best option, not having to leave a company I'd invested over a decade of my life in and working from the inside out with my coworkers to ensure we have a bigger voice on the job and to improve our working conditions. And so I said yes, very naively and not at all knowing what that was going to entail. And very idealistically, assuming that the company would give us a little bit of pushback, but that ultimately they would be the company that they say they are and acknowledge that this is the right move and lead the industry like they do. And instead, a year later, we're still fighting for our lives. Now, my store was the first to unionize. We were successful and able to do that. And it has started a national movement for this campaign. As of yesterday, I think we have 235 unionized locations across the US, which encompasses just under, I believe, 6,000 baristas. But there are 400,000 approximately baristas, Starbucks baristas in the United States. So, we still are working really, really hard, but we're getting stronger every single day. And we are able to do this alongside all of these wonderful folks also organizing their workplaces and Amazon. And it's just a really fantastic, amazing climate to be a part of, because what Hayden said is it's the support of fellow unions. I mean, we were never doing this alone. This one little store in Buffalo that was able to do this back in December of 2021 did not get there alone. It would have been impossible for us to do that alone. So I never want to lose sight of that and continue to acknowledge it, because it's what's going to allow all of us here to keep fighting this fight.
Yeah, you mentioned that you've been working there over a decade, and that is a long time for, a service job, right? That's not common. And John Rocky in the chat mentioned that. And also wanted to shout out, we've got David Story in the chat. Appreciate that. He's co-founder of the show, and always love to see him continuing to engage. And so before we go to our first break, let's... before we even get into unions, what is a union? What does a union do? What is a worker? One of the things that I tried to do when I was thinking about the panel is I did try to get several different types of what we would call workers, right? And so we've got people, Hayden isn't, she hasn't actually been, she's not actually a coal miner, right? But she's very much, those are her people. We've got flight attendants, and grad workers and service workers. And so this is and we've got people who have negotiated contracts, people who've been on strike, people who are currently on strike, people organizing new unions who've been doing that so, a really wide and kind of representative swath of what's going on in labor in the country. And so because of the diversity of the jobs that we've got, I'm interested, Hayden, in what you would say to the question of what is a worker? Who are the people that can form unions? What is a worker?
Well, a worker is anyone that someone else is exploiting their labor for profit. So anyone, if you're producing income for someone else, you are a worker. So myself, I'm also a high school English teacher. I'm still part of the working class. I'm producing materials. I'm producing students to go out into the world and either be college or career ready. And I've compensated that. I also have a boss that dictates certain things to me. So I think that we've had a big problem in the country the past several years of trying to divide working class people into white collar and blue collar work, to make someone feel superior or to give the illusion of, oh, look how good you have it. You don't need to organize amongst yourselves. You don't need a union. That's only for the other section of people. And that's completely untrue. All workers will benefit from union representation.
That's why I asked you, because one of the things that people always say to people like Michelle or Graham or Lee is, oh, coal miners, they need unions, right? But grad students, baristas, retail workers, no, they don't need unions. They're not actually even workers, some people will say. And so officially, I think we've got a coal miner's wife coming on and saying that's nonsense. So we're never going to hear that again, is my expectation.
Yeah, I wanted to jump on, if it's possible, Jake, I wanted to jump in on this too, because I think there's this impression of the working class that is like distinctly a like 20th century idea of what the working class is, when a 21st century, a 2022 working class is made up of women and queer people and non-binary people. It's overwhelmingly made up of people of color. It's got sectors that are vastly distinct. Even within something like the United Auto Workers, I remember 2 years ago when we went on strike, we had our classic, UAW on strike placards, and tourists, NYU butts up against Washington Square Park. And so tourists will come by and be like, the auto workers, who are they here in solidarity with? And we as graduate students, shared that there are these white collar sectors, technical, office, and professional, it's not just grad workers, but legal aid. There's a vast growing number of legal aid and attorneys in the UAW. And which is, I would never say, like, I know for the folks on the line, like, as I've learned more about the history of the auto workers and the men and women who work in the plants, I'm never going to be at risk of bodily harm in like losing a finger at my job. But at the same time, as Hayden has so concisely and precisely articulated, like, I love that definition of like people who don't have control over their time and energy and output because they need to work for wages to live. And sometimes those wages are really high, right? But I think about auto workers who are skilled technicians, underwater welders, longshoremen, and you might hear something like their salary and draw a distinction, which is ultimately arbitrary because they're not property owners and they're not people who earn wealth from the labor of other people. Like, that's what makes up the working class.
Right. Yeah. Does your money, to the extent that you have it, come from your money, or does it come from your labor, the sweat of your brow, or the sweat of your brain, so to speak? Right. That's definitely the important dividing line. And there was somebody, I think maybe Zach Patton on Twitter, mentioned that, I'm a longshore worker. I make like $150,000 a year, and I'm damn proud of it. And I don't make too much. You make too little, right? And look at how much the longshore bosses are making, right? And that's definitely the important dividing line there. And so let's get one more question out of the way, and then we'll go to our first break. So we've got a working definition of workers, which is important because I'm in a union environment where I'm white collar, right? I work on the computer all day. I sit in my cube and I work on the computer. And I have a lot of coworkers that they do not conceive of themselves as workers. They conceive of themselves as professionals. And all of these, maybe there are interesting conversations that we can have about the divisions in the working class and what that does to people. But the important thing is to understand that we are working class. And so with that working definition, what is a union then? And for that, I'm interested, Michelle. I'll let you take that away.
So a union is a collective of workers that are able to use that as their voice when it comes up to, people like, let's say, Starbucks corporate, and use that voice to gain a collective bargaining agreement, but also to hold that company accountable. So I think the biggest thing, and this goes, right to the longshoremen, when you get those things, when you get those benefits, this also relates to Johnny's sort of gray area, right? A lot of these companies will try to say that a union is a third party. You know, it's actually it's a barrier between the worker and the corporate representatives, or the worker and the company. But the actuality is it's the only thing that allows the workers to hold that company accountable. Starbucks is really big on claiming the amazing benefits that they already offer their workers, which I can tell you as one of their workers is not actually as good as they say it is. But let's just say that it was. There's still nothing preventing Starbucks from pulling those benefits away. The only thing preventing Starbucks from coming in and taking those benefits from us once they've been offered is a collective bargaining agreement, is a contract. So it's really hard for me, this whole third party narrative, and they used it quite a bit in their anti-union campaign here in Buffalo when they were trying to stop this from happening to begin with, is, you know, we want to be able to have a conversation with each and every one of our partners. We don't want to have to go through a union representative. Well, first of all, that's completely unrealistic that you're ever going to have a conversation with every 400,000 of us. The better thing for us is to be able to have a union collectively made up of your workers that can have these conversations and then come to you, with maybe one rep or two reps, but representative of the 400,000 people standing behind us, and be able to say, this is what we need. This is what we need on the floors of these stores. Nobody knows what we need better to run these stores than the people actually running them. And when we sign that agreement with these benefits that you offer us, we want to make sure you can't come and take them away. I personally, in the 12 years I've been with the company, I know some of the benefits we had when I started in 2010, and I could make a nice little list of the ones that have already been just taken away from us unilaterally without any conversation. And so a union allows us to have that voice and to hold the company accountable.
And there are several things that are important and that I want to pull out there. And one of those is that, you said that it's a collective of workers coming together for, a better workplace, better working conditions and stuff like this. And that is a definition that's not dependent on the government. That's a definition that's not dependent on the boss recognizing that you're a union. If you come together, you say you're a union, then by golly, you're a union, right? And it doesn't matter what anybody else says. And that's an important thing to understand. And we should, I think we should, and I think most of us, we're all in unions that more or less agree with this. We should make use of the state power through the National Labor Relations Board and the National Labor Relations Act where we can and where it makes sense. But if all of that falls away tomorrow, and that's not the case, and we're in a landscape without legal protection for unions. Workers had those before those legal protections. Workers had unions when it was expressly illegal, right? And so it's important to understand that, whether or not you have a union election, if you're coming together with people on your job and advocating for yourselves, then that's the working definition of a union. That's the thing that's important there. Graham, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yes, I did. You kind of touched on it, but in our organizing at REI, a lot of people, hadn't either been in a union or didn't know what a union was. We have a lot of people who are either in college or recently graduated, or have been in those more like quote unquote professional white collar jobs, who are sort of in a second career, or this is their like fun retail job, who didn't really know what a union was. And so when explaining it to people, the one point that we as organizers try to make is that, no matter what union you're affiliated with, whether you affiliate at all, ultimately the union is us. We are the ones who are making the decisions. We are the ones who are deciding, when to use our power, how to use our power as workers. So yeah, that is just kind of the fine point that I wanted to put on that, is that, if you call yourself a union, you are a union because it is made up of you and however many coworkers you have. And the trick is just becoming organized and knowing how to wield the power of your collective voice.
Absolutely, absolutely. Johnny, was there anything that you wanted to pull out of that before we move on?
Yes, thank you. Everyone said it so perfectly, that you are the union. Once you start talking to your coworkers and you all decide that, hey, we need to come together to make changes in the workplace, that is the day that your union has started. And it doesn't need to be a large number. It could be 2 of you. As soon as you say, hey, let's do something about this, your union has been formed. And that's it. And so with everyone has talked about third partying the union. That is, well, I'm sure we'll get to this later, a big union busting tactic. Knowing that you are a union as soon as you start talking about making change, that deads that right there. So yeah, just to echo what everyone said, you are the union as soon as you start talking about it.
We will go to the next question, which is, why are unions good? Why are unions good? We know what a worker is. We know what a union is. We've talked a little bit about it, but why are they good? And I'm going to kick it back to Lee to answer this question, because I think that she'll have a good answer for us in general, but also she has a really good personal story that we've talked about on the show already. But yeah, so Lee, why are unions good? Why should one do a union?
I've been asked a lot by my family. So I'm based in New York City right now, but I grew up in rural South Texas. And a lot of my family, just by virtue of like the culture and historic attitudes towards unions, have been pretty anti-union. And when I went off to college and learned more, it was a decision that I made. But this is a conversation I have at home all the time with my aunts, uncles, cousins, of like, let me break it down of like what this union does for me. So the reason I think unions are a good thing, there's like the theory-ish stuff of like the thing I believe in my like soul and my values. And then there's like the practical stuff that happens. The thing I believe in my soul and my values, and is like, could be called like theory, is that like, I really believe that unions as an institution are this other thing besides like government, besides the institution of the family, besides the institution of education, that does good things and is able to take collective action around something that everybody has to do every day, which is work in order to live. And so what unions do is like bring together people and influence the way that society and politics happens. Like who gets what, when, where, and how, and under what conditions. Like that's what a union does. And like, that is why I think that like in theory, they're a good thing. And in practice, they also just do the work that a lot of other institutions believe they do or say they do that don't in fact do them, or do them in ways that don't actually benefit workers. So like universities are a really strong example of this, because they often use the metaphor of a family, and they also use the metaphor of like they are just like places where you get an education. When one of the largest landowners in the borough of Manhattan is Columbia University and New York University. Like they are financial institutions. In addition, we have this running joke that New York University is a real estate company that also gives degrees. And it's like kind of a reality, because they've eaten up so much property and played a significant part in gentrification of New York City. And so what a union does is kind of bring that to the fore and say, you're not our family. You're not like this beneficial force that, actually you are a disciplinarian. Actually, what you do is withdraw benefits is retaliation. And that is what a union does, is pushes up against that and uses the power of the collective to fight back against it. Like in a really practical way, like one of the things that so visualizes what a union does and why it's good is this like kind of cartoon. And it's like kind of childish, but we've all seen the cartoon of like one big fish and then like a gazillion little fish. And the little fish around it can be eaten up by the big fish, but when they make the big fish together are bigger than the big fish. Like, I believe that cartoon in my soul. And it encapsulates like these like bigger ideas and practices that I've been talking about in a really concise way of like, together we're so much more.
Absolutely. If there's I don't know of a political cartoon that is more true in more ways than the Big Fish cartoon. That's definitely a really good one. And just for the general thing of that's like mechanically how unions get the good things that they get. And so what are some of the things that y'all were able to win? How has the union been good for you personally?
Yeah. So the three biggest things that I think come up for me are wages, healthcare, and what would be called like social issues, or like what we call in UAWD bargaining for the common good, which is not just bargaining for yourself, but bargaining for everybody. And so in terms of wages, when the Graduate Student Organizing Committee started in 2015, their hourly wage was $15 an hour. And at the time, that was higher than the average minimum wage in New York City. But we at GSOC were the first private union to organize at a words are hard. First union to organize at a private university after a set of NLRB decisions. What that meant is that we knew that our wages set the floor. And so every contract after us, we are constantly pushing it up because, NYU will like to say like, oh, it's just us here. Like, this is just our contract. But we know that Harvard is going to say, well, at NYU, they make this. Or uptown at Columbia, they'll say at NYU, they make this. And so that's a really important bargaining chip. And so we've gone from $15 an hour in 2015 to $30 an hour by 2026. That's huge. In terms of healthcare, most of our unit is actually master's students. So they're paying like $60,000 a year to get a degree. And then they're required to have health insurance on top of that. A lot of people don't know that graduate students are not children. They're full grown adults. Often they don't qualify for their parents' health insurance. And so when you're in our unit, you get a 95% reimbursement on the healthcare premium, which is around $3,500. Lastly, for bargaining for the common good, we made NYU be a sanctuary campus and agree that cops on campus pose a health and safety risk to everyone on campus, especially workers. And this was huge for us. It's saying that, ICE can't come on campus, cops can't come on campus. Like, you're a private institution, you can make that decision and you have not. Well, we're not going to work for you until you do too. And that was a huge win in our last contract and something that I believe really deeply in.
Yeah, that's great news. Being able to protect your members and students on campus is very important. Johnny, did you want to add anything to that? What would you say? What would you say if somebody asked you why are unions good?
Unions are good for the reasons that Lee stated, and as well, we've been talking about this for a while now. Upper management, CEOs, shareholders, they have no clue what's going on in the day-to-day in the workplace. If you ask them to come in to work and to fill in, they would probably do a very bad job and probably make it worse. So in that sense, you need the workers, the people who are there with the day-to-day, doing all the hard work. They need to have a voice in the workplace and how it functions, what the company looks like, because we know more than anyone else. We know. So having a union and us being a part of that is giving us that voice to say, hey, this is not okay. You're doing this. This does not work for the workplace. It doesn't work for the customer. It doesn't work for this. We're on the front lines. And you have that backing, that power, that voice to make those changes and to get them to listen to you. Without that, they could take suggestions. Like my company, we, are non-union. Flight attendants have a very unique job. And as you all have seen throughout the pandemic, that we face some interesting working conditions. We faced a lot of workplace violence. And if you've been flying lately, there have been long delays or cancellations that do affect you directly. And flight attendants were saying, hey, these conditions are not okay for the passengers, are not okay for us as well. But without the power of a union and a contract backing us, it's just a suggestion to make those changes to benefit everyone. And so that's what's really important about a union, having one, why we need one, and what it does. And so, our AFA has won some big improvements for the airline industry, like no knives on the airplanes. That was AFA, no phones, so people could listen and hear instructions. And so those things are important. And so without them fighting for us, we'd have never gotten stuff like that in the workplace.
Yes, and Jeb asked, sent us a text message, saw where some Delta pilots had pickets up yesterday. Are they union? And if so, do they support the attendance organizing? That's an interest. Are the Delta pilots associated with the ALPA?
Yes, Delta pilots are union. The only employees that are union at Delta are our pilots and our dispatch. We are 20% a union, which is unheard of. All the other airlines are like 80, 90%. And so our Delta pilots are definitely supporting our campaign for the first time. And we're also supporting their contract negotiations. And so this is what solidarity and unionizing, this is what this looks like in real time. Workers coming together, even from different departments, and saying, hey, we're going to support each other against this larger management entity that's both trying to work us to death. They used to pit the pilots and flight attendants against one another. Like, oh, you're going to take a piece of their pie if you unionize. And so now we started talking to each other and saying, hey, we're both on the same side here. There's enough pie for everyone. Our CEOs and shareholders are getting all of it, and we're getting the crumbs. Let's fight together and to make sure that we get our fair share. And now that we're doing that, we're usually on the picket lines with them. And so it's been great having that support and solidarity.
Absolutely. And so so now we're working through this. We know what a worker is, we know what a union is, we know why they're good. Okay. Let's say you've convinced me. I'm a listener. I'm convinced. This sounds dope as hell. I want to do one of these things. How do I do that? I'll kick it over to you, Graham. You've got some firsthand experience. How does one do a union?
Yes. So the first step in doing a union is first to form an organizing committee. So a group of trusted coworkers that you can rely on and you can trust to do a lot of the legwork. Also to keep it secret at the beginning, because the element of surprise is a source of power and was a huge source of power for us at REI. But yeah, the very first step is to find, my coworkers, I was actually approached by a coworker and they were like, hey, come to the park. I want to talk to you about something. And so from that, that sort of created our very first organizing committee meeting. And from that point on, we've stuck by each other throughout this whole experience, from having one-on-one conversations with our coworkers after that. Sorry, there's a cat. And getting authorization cards signed, having our election, going through the experience of union busting. So yeah, step one, find some trusted coworkers and meet with them often to sort of map your workplace and get the strategy, the groundwork down.
What about Michelle? Do you have anything that you'd add to that? Of course, how do you form a union? Right, we're answering this in 5 minutes. We're not going to be able. There are resources. The organizing campaigns take years, right? But we're distilling this, right? So Michelle, what would you add to that?
I'm going to echo everything that Graham said. First of all, the element of surprise is very important. Finding the coworkers you can trust initially to keep that a secret, but to also help garner additional support. That conversation I referenced in my intro, I got a text message from that coworker asking me if I wanted to get a cup of coffee after one of our shifts later that week, which I will let you know. I mean, we literally serve coffee all day. So it was an interesting text message. And I was like, yeah, sure. I mean, we'll probably have already had 16 cups by that point, but yeah, absolutely. But what she also did was, I was one of the last people in Buffalo that was reached out to in our market in terms of forming that organizing committee. And I don't fault her for any of that. At that point, I'd been with the company 11 years. And so that kind of tenure usually would breed a certain level of loyalty, or at least a perceived level of loyalty. And so there was some apprehension to talking to someone who'd been with the company that long. Like the potential of me feeling the opposite and running to management was pretty high. And I'm grateful every day that she still chose to have that conversation. But that's the strategy that you need to employ when you're at those very beginning stages. You have to sort of map that out. Our organizing committee was not just store specific, even though we were filing for individual stores. There's 20 stores in the Buffalo market, 20 Starbucks locations. And I believe every single one of them had at least one representative on our organizing committee. So it was really important from the beginning for us to map out the city, knowing that the company would inevitably come at us and probably try to divide and conquer in terms of pitting one store against the other. So we were able to sort of have eyes and ears on the ground in every one of those locations. And that was very essential to, like I said, Elmwood happened to be the first location to win, but there were 19 other stores in our market standing behind that store to get us over that finish line. The next step, I think, is making sure that you're there to take care of each other, because in almost every case, the anti-union campaign is going to come at you, and it's going to come at you strong. And it's very scary and it's very intimidating. And a lot of this new labor movement is on the younger side. I'm not including myself in that. I'm actually probably on the older side of it. But a lot of my coworkers, 2 of the coworkers at the Elmwood location were high school seniors, and they're being brought into, one-on-ones or 2-on-ones or 3-on-ones with not only, upper management and corporate, but, the president of Starbucks North America, who's bringing in $4 million a year. That's an intimidating situation. So making sure that you're continually checking in on your coworkers after those instances, seeing what kind of support they need, showing them what you're able to give them, as one of their fellow workers, as the union that corporate is just not concerned about. They don't care about the mental health of what they're putting these young workers through. They don't care about the physical toll, that is having on them. And so making sure that your coworkers feel as supported as possible. And if there are coworkers who don't feel like they have the strength to use their voices in those anti-union meetings, I think back to some of those instances and watching coworkers be brought to tears because of just the stress of being put in that situation to begin with. Having the voice to speak, to stand up for them and say, this is wrong. What you're doing to this person is wrong. It shouldn't be happening. And, I'm going to stand with them, and I'll use my voice if they don't feel like they can use theirs. That was what allowed us to get that first store. And that's what's allowing all of these stores since then. I'm watching the solidarity of baristas across the country stand up for one another, and call corporate out on their absolutely awful behavior. And when one person stands up, it gives the next person the strength to stand up. And that's what's happening right now.
Let's explain for people, what is union busting? And I'll go to Johnny Lane to kick us off with that.
Yes, because I feel like my company has perfected union busting in the 30 plus years they've been trying to keep out a union at Delta. Union busting is exactly what it sounds like. It's the company trying to come in and dissuade workers from forming a union, and that's by any means necessary. Some of us have discussed captive audience meetings where their management comes in. You could be there with food, drinks, whatever, your other coworkers, and someone just starts talking about why it's bad to have a union, why it's scary. Some of the language that you may hear is no more open door policy. You won't be able to speak with management directly anymore. We're a family. Why would you want a third party to come in and disrupt the family atmosphere? One of my favorites that my company uses is preserving our culture, which is, being from the South, those types of terms are rooted in white supremacy. So when you hear things like that, it can get kind of scary and your radar should go up. But those are just a few things that you may see at the beginning for them to kind of put in your mind that, oh, maybe having a union is bad. Food is often something that they'll use, like, oh, we're a family, we're providing you with pizza or ice cream. So it could seem like it's very harmless, but a lot of these tactics are very insidious. And that's just some of the beginning of union busting that you may see when you start your campaign. Delta's known for some of their very public ads that have gotten around in recent years. One of the more famous ones is instead of paying $50 for dues, you could buy a $700 PlayStation. The dues that you would spend in a year would go to buying a PlayStation or Braves tickets. And so it was just incredibly insulting that they would think that even like $50 that people were saving up for things like that they could spend that instead. Somehow that would have a PlayStation or a Braves tickets would have more value than collective bargaining power in the workplace. But unfortunately, some people do fall for it.
Yeah, one of the things that they said is that, dues might be $500 a year or something, and that you could buy a PlayStation with that instead. And I think it was either the AFL-CIO or the AFA that tweeted, also you could construct a guillotine. And then they deleted that post because, I don't know, somebody got a little too scared. And that is a critique that I have of the social media policy of some unions. They're not radical enough. They do not lean into the edgelord stuff enough. I think more guillotine imagery. That's my take. But we've mentioned this earlier in the show, the captive audience meetings. And Michelle, you touched on that really, and it's really intimidating. What are some of the things that they'll tell you in these captive audience meetings that you're forced to go to, or you could potentially lose your job?
So the first thing I'm going to say is that the company will never refer to them as a captive audience meeting. They like to call them things like listening sessions, which is what Starbucks corporate like to call them. They'll also like to tell you that they're not mandatory. However, you're paid to attend. And so if you're an hourly worker working paycheck to paycheck, and the option is go to this 1 hour meeting, because the stores, in most cases, the stores are shut down for these meetings. And so you're told, hey, your shift for that day is canceled. We're shutting the store down because we're having these listening sessions. So you can come to this 1 hour listening session and be paid for your entire shift that you were scheduled for. But if you don't come to this 1 hour listening session, then you're not paid for that shift. So you can say they're not mandatory, but the reality of the situation is you're dealing with hourly workers who need this income. And so their only option is to attend that listening session or that captive audience meeting. Then they start off very innocuous. The company narrative here in Buffalo was that this was coincidental, that all of these management and corporate were in Buffalo at just mere days after the filing of the first few union petitions. They had heard that there were problems in our market. And they were here to address them and to fix them. And they didn't know why things were so bad here, but none of the problems happening at the Starbucks stores in Buffalo were happening anywhere else in the country. So something had just happened, something had gone wrong here in Buffalo. And they were here to address that and to fix it, because this wasn't the true Starbucks experience. We weren't getting the true Starbucks experience, and they wanted to fix that for us. So that's how those meetings start out. And they'll get through, 50 minutes of talking at you. And then the last 10 they'll reserve for, well, we also wanted to address this union campaign. And they'll slowly work that into the conversation about how they don't feel like it's necessary. It will destroy the partner-to-partner relationship that we've, spent 50 years cultivating in the company. And they're going to fix all of the issues, which, by the way, the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act, says they can't do. When a union campaign starts, one of the things that has to be maintained is what is called laboratory conditions, which means they can't come into a shop that's trying to organize, and they can't make things better, and they can't make things worse. So coming in at the start of a union campaign and saying we're going to fix all of the problems is actually not legal. But they frame that as a way, but we're here to take care of everything so that we can just let this pesky union campaign go. You don't have to worry about it. And those meetings get more and more aggressive the closer you get to the vote, to the point where the last couple, I actually wasn't permitted to attend the last listening session for Elmwood, because at that point they were dividing the store up into, very vocal union supporters and not so vocal union supporters. And the meeting that I wanted to attend had some not so vocal union supporters. And when I showed up, they said, oh, you're not able to stay for this meeting. Mm-hmm. So they get more and more aggressive, and they basically say, hey, we don't want a union. We want everybody to vote, because not voting to them is the equivalent of a yes vote in a lot of cases. And we want you all to vote no. I mean, it's that blatant. It's not, it's not even thinly veiled at this point.
Right.
And it can get really scary and really intimidating. And you have to, sort of be prepared to stand up and speak for your coworkers and call them out on their incredible lies and misinformation. It was one of the scariest things I've ever done. Sitting there, their third party narrative is also very, very, very strong. To echo what Johnny said, they like to say, we're just giving you the facts, and if you want to get facts on the union, then you should you should contact one of your union reps. And that very first meeting, I raised my hand and I said, well, I'm one of the organizing members, and I would be happy to answer any questions anybody might have. And my heart was pounding out of my chest. I mean, there wasn't a single meeting I sat at where my Apple Watch didn't give me a high heart rate notification. And we need to take that into account when workers are trying to organize, the mental and physical toll that they're put through simply for trying to exercise what is their right under the law in this country.
And all of this by people that hold their paycheck in their hands, right? I mean, this is a really, really big deal for folks. And one of the things that they'll tell people at retail stores and at restaurants like Starbucks and like REI is they're going to close your store if you organize. Graham, how did you address that because I'm assuming that came up, or there were implications in your campaign in New York. How did y'all speak to that concern?
So we actually didn't hear anything about closing the store from corporate in New York. The Soho location, it's a flagship store. It's in the Puck building, so it's a very historic location. It's almost like one of the prize gems of REI's the national company. So there wasn't really anything about store closure. But I can definitely agree with Michelle about the experience of sitting through these captive audience meetings and, I think there was for some people, the fear of being vocal and you might not lose your store location, but people being scared of being fired for being vocal. But the more vocal you are, the more you are protected by the National Labor Relations Act. And that's something that we really, really tried to hit home during these captive audience meetings. And it actually resulted in there not there was not a single captive audience meeting that REI ran where there was not just belligerent pushback from, several members of staff. So yeah, we didn't really run into the store closure thing, but people were afraid of being fired for their beliefs, for wanting this right of organizing at work. And we made it very, very clear that this is safe. It is essential that we push back on management, and that the more vocal you are and the more you actually take ownership of this union, the more protected you are against any attack from management.
So in the last 10 minutes, we've talked about union busting, what the boss is going to do. There are a couple of anti-union talking points that you're going to hear in these captive audience meetings that you might hear from people that you know in your family. Like, why are you, I hear this about unions. Why are you doing this when I hear this? And so I'll go to Hayden for the first one because I think that she's in a really good spot to answer this question. And this is from a listener. Jack from New Jersey recently had a conversation with my very anti-union boss, who was telling a story about a potentially believable complaint about a public school teacher failing his son from an educational perspective, but drawing the absolute worst possible conclusions from the experience. While I strongly believe these situations would be less prevalent if public schools were adequately funded, teachers paid enough, etc., there is a reality of people being failed by the system. What are some thoughts on how a hopefully future parent could handle that kind of situation with solidarity, Hayden?
Okay, so let me make sure I'm understanding the complaint there. They believe that the student was failed to be properly educated by a union
by the teacher and his anti-union boss, who, it's a boss, so but his anti-union boss is saying that, this is an example of unions protecting, lazy teachers and they're standing in the way of progress and standing in the way of customer experience or the education for the students, right?
Well, first of all, let's go ahead and make it very clear. A union is not necessarily going to protect a poor worker. What a union does is it gives you wind garden rights. It says that you can't be brought in for discipline or fired without cause. Now, that means that you're going to have to go through the proper channels. Your boss just can't not like you, or a parent can't just complain and say, well, it's the teacher's fault that my child did nothing all year. What that does is it requires there's due process. So just like we have a system of checks and balances, or we should, even within the government, if there's channels that things go through that are fact-checked, that are supposed to be done before a decision is made. The union works not just to protect that worker, but to also protect the students, the faculty, and the climate of the school. So we're not going to base something off one complaint. You would have a due process and a representative there to actually get the facts and give you a voice, to where it's not a situation of he said, she said, and it escalates into a huge disagreement. You have someone there that's representing the best, actually, in that case, for the student and the teacher, and that would be your union representative through your wind garden rights.
Right. And that's, almost exactly what we said a couple of weeks ago when we got a similar question. And Adam, who was a former public school teacher, former teachers union, ostensibly, professional association here in Alabama staffer. And Adam, was there anything that you wanted to make sure that we added to that? I know that you've been kind of quiet during the show. Was there anything you wanted to add to that question?
Yeah, absolutely. Since I was involved in representing workers who were tenured and put up for termination. And let me just say, if management's job is to be management, if there is a worker whose conduct is so awful and egregious, they deserve to be fired. And frankly, it should be awful, egregious conduct that gets you fired and takes away your livelihood. But if, that does happen, and if there's a worker, in this case, a tenured teacher, whose conduct is so bad, but yet they can't be terminated, that sounds like a problem with management. That sounds like management is lazy or incompetent or unable to follow due process, because there's not a union in this country and probably in the world that I'm aware of that enshrines the right to poor conduct in a contract, right? No union says we want our employees to be able to behave badly at work, to not show up on time, et cetera, et cetera. But it's management's job to be management and to follow due process, to discipline workers according to policy and contract. So, that's what I always told folks, when they brought those concerns to me about protecting a lazy or incompetent teacher. The only way they're protected is if their administrator is more lazy and more incompetent than the teacher in question, right? Everybody is entitled to due process, or should be entitled to due process. You're talking about taking away someone's livelihood, their ability to feed their family. It's not a lot to ask that they be able to produce some documentation.
Exactly. This is a question that you're going to get, that people, especially in service work like Starbucks, they get this question all the time, which is, if you hate your job, why don't you just leave it? Why don't you just get another job, Michelle? Why don't you just get another job?
I mean, I think the first part of wrong information in there is that we hate our jobs, because we don't. Part of what Starbucks was really good at is creating this community and creating these environments in these stores that allow you to have these connections with your customers, with the community around you, and with your fellow coworkers within your store. They actually they cultivate that. They encourage you to create those. We actually have a term in the company called a customer connection. So we don't hate our jobs. I mean, before this organizing effort, I'd been with the company 11 years. If I'd hated the job, I wouldn't have been with the company for 11 years. We love our shops, and we love our customers, and we love the people we work with. And when you love something, you work to make it better. You don't seek to leave it or tear it down. We're simply asking for the opportunity to have a voice in those shops, to be able to, have a direct line to the people making the decisions, essentially, and allow us to have the opportunity to help with those decisions. Right now, we're at the mercy of whoever's sitting up in some tower in Seattle and passing these, procedures and protocols down to us and saying, well, now we need you to do this. There's no conversation with those hourly workers to say, is this actually going to be what's best for the store, for the customer, for the workers? There's no conversation. And that became more and more evident in the middle of a global pandemic. When we were being asked to enact even safety precautions that just weren't sufficient. And there was no leadway whatsoever to be able to say, hey guys, this isn't working. There was no way to say this is what you're asking us to do. It's not feasible. It's not working. And so we don't hate our jobs at all. And I think there's also there's a mentality within the service industry in general. And I think you touched on it earlier, that these jobs are temporary, or they're unskilled. And so you should just be able to suck it up. If you are in this situation for a limited period of time, you're putting yourself through college, or you're, in high school, or this is temporary while you're in the middle of a career change, that you should it's acceptable to deal with a certain level of disrespect. And it's acceptable to not have safe working conditions, and it's acceptable to not have fair wages. And for one thing, that's just absolutely not the case. I don't care if you're doing this job for 3 months or if you're doing this job for 12 years. Those are things that should be ensured to every worker. Certainly when the umbrella of that job is a multi-billion-dollar corporation who can do so much and more for their workers, and would just choose to keep the shareholders happy, as opposed to ensuring that their employees, who bring in those billions of dollars of profit, are taken care of.
Folks are going to start dropping off here in about 15, 20 minutes, and Lee had a question that she wanted to get to, and I went ahead, just to keep the frames so I don't have to do so much, I went ahead and brought Joe in, Joe from Labor Notes. He's going to be talking to us about stewards a little bit later. Is that fine, Joe, that you're going to be audience member for a little bit? Fantastic. So Lee, you had a question that you wanted to answer, which is something that you said that you've got a cousin who asks you this, and this is another thing that we talked about with Adam, because he gets a similar complaint as a stagehand. And the question was, I like unions in theory, but they're inefficient in practice. Why does it take 6 guys to do the work that one person could do? And so we're talking here about like job descriptions. Like unions are going to have job descriptions. You have to do, it is kind of frowned upon to do work for free in a union environment. Call me crazy, but so Lee, talk to us about that question that you got from your cousin and how you try to respond to him.
Yeah, like I said, I'm from Texas, and even though I'm from a part of Texas that's really historically involved in farm labor, there was like a lot of migrant laborers, and United Farm Workers was really big in South Texas where I grew up. At the same time, like the political conditions in South Texas have shifted such that a lot of folks who are Mexican American have a really specific political agenda. So like a lot of my family is really anti-union as working class people, as electricians, as farmers, and ranchers. And so for my cousin, like we were literally at Thanksgiving, and he's like, I'm a lineman. When the electricity goes out, like we can't wait for one more person to, go up the ladder and open the box and whatever it is. And I think the way that this is not a question I have a fantastic answer to, but what's important about it is like learning together with someone. Like I don't have all the answers, and it would be ridiculous to think that any one organizer does. So that's what I told him. It was like, that's a really good question. And I don't know what your working conditions are like. Like you've known me longer than I've known me. And you know that I'm a nerd, that I read and write for my job. I'm an educator. I don't know what it's like to have to restore electricity after a hurricane. But at the same time, like this feels like something that I've been told in my workplace, which is that like there's a parcelization or segmentation of labor. And like that just doesn't, what it actually means in practice is like, it's not about many different people having one small job, even though that acknowledges that work is a collective effort that takes many people. That parcelization means that job, which is incredibly dangerous, probably needs some safeguards. So I think about like I said, I haven't fully thought this through, so I don't have a catchy line phrase, but like one of the things that I've heard in listening into like the conversation around pilots need more rest between flights because they're doing this really crazy, responsible, heavy job. I don't know what it's like to be an electrician or a lineman, but something tells me that if you're up in the air being fatigued, being having to work really long hours under stressful conditions, having more people rather than less people, it isn't actually about what you as a person can and can't do or more or less equipped to do, but keeping everybody safe. And so that's what my gut said. That's what my intuition said. But oftentimes when you think about like, it takes, it's always somebody else's job, or it takes a bunch of people to do the work. It's like, actually, that's probably because for the first time you're working in a safe workplace and everybody there is as rested as they needed and has the ability to like combat fatigue or combat like the challenges that they otherwise face on the job.
Right. Does anybody else have, and Adam, I'll throw it to you if none of the other three have anything else to say, because I know.
I think Graham had some context from the REI position.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is actually so relevant to what's going on at REI right now in our contract negotiations, because we have a lot of different departments that deal with like extremely oversized or heavy equipment, like kayaks, canoes, bikes. I myself work in the bike shop department. So my job is like actually pretty dangerous. So just having like a specific example that's relevant to just kind of having multiple people to help with one job. We have to hang bikes on the ceiling in our action sports department. So basically where we sell all of the skis, the bikes, all the stuff that you need to like get outdoors and have a fun time. So we hang bikes on the ceiling, and there is a complete lack of training. Typically, there are only 2 people who actually do this job. So something that we're asking for in our contract is specific training on how to safely put a bike onto the ceiling and have a minimum number of people involved in that task. So just to kind of like, I guess, answer this question, like there is the concern about safety. So of course, having more people involved in a task makes it so that, for example, with the bike, one person is hanging the bike, one person is spotting, and another person is like directing the flow of customers. And then also having the specific training around that task. You know, one person is trained to hang, one person is trained to spot, and one person is trained to direct the flow of traffic. So that everybody is utilizing their own expertise to its fullest potential. So just kind of a cool, relevant example from REI.
And I think the most important thing, you know, there's a lot of things that we could mention and that we could add. And I started off saying that it's kind of frowned upon to do work for free. And that's what you're doing if you do work outside of your job description, right? Is you are doing work for free for the company. And there's no reason to do that because they would not do the same thing for you. But the most important thing is what Graham mentioned, is that they are putting this in their contract. They are talking about this language. They are talking through this. Who is they? The workers there. So if there is genuinely, if there is genuinely just an absurd work rule, guess who can change that? You can. As the worker who bargains your next contract, you can get on the negotiating committee. You can be on the bargaining committee. Run on eliminating this dumb work rule and get on the bargaining committee. Because there's, right, I'm sure there's 300 million people in the United States. There are 100 million plus workers. I'm sure, you know, probably not a whole lot, probably less than people think, but I'm sure there's some that are silly. Well, get rid of it. If it's your contract, if it's your workplace, you get rid of it. That's up to you.
Yeah, that was the one point I was just going to throw in there, is that, you know, who's making the decision? When I'm hanging up lights for a concert and we're supposed to do two people per light, if I choose myself to just do it by myself, you know, that's on me. That's my choice. Maybe they are lighter than normal and I can handle that. But that's different than when, you know, if someone in management were to come to us and say, hey, actually, forget about the 2 people per light rule. You're all just going to do it by yourself. You know, that's different. And I think whenever it comes to worker safety versus profitability or, you know, perceived efficiency or saving time, any of that, we should always err on the side of worker safety. And I don't think unions should ever apologize for that.
Yeah, I can add a little bit too, if that's okay. A lot of it's going to piggyback on what Graham said and a little bit on what Adam said. But some of the things we're talking about in our proposals for the first Starbucks contract is a minimum staffing requirement, which really doesn't necessarily exist. Maybe in theory it exists, but if you're, you know, in the middle of a shift and you have 2 people call off, there's nothing right now that protects us in terms of where does that workload then get dispersed. It gets dispersed to the 5 people who are on that shift. And what happens to the profits that are coming in because the company's now not paying 2 employees, but the same amount of profits in theory are coming in. So where is that going? That's going right back to the company. So one of the things, aside from a minimum staffing requirement, would be the ability to, if we're short-staffed, to shut down some channels. I don't know, I'm certain most people are not super familiar with how a Starbucks is run, but there's multiple channels for customers. There's there's the in-house channel. In a lot of cases, there's a drive-through channel. Now there's a mobile order and pay channel. In a lot of cases, there's a delivery channel. All of those require people to run them. And you have a couple people call off and you're still expected to run all of those channels. So we want a couple of things: the ability to be able to shut down certain channels if we're short-staffed, to try to make sure that we're not doubling the workload of the people who were able to be there. And secondly, is compensation for working short-staffed. It's inevitable that our workload is going to, at minimum, probably double if people are unable to be there. And that shouldn't be automatic additional profit for the company. That should somehow be dispersed so that there's that compensation for working harder than you would normally be working is sent back to those people who are working that shift. We're not saying shut the shop down, which is, of course, their narrative. We're not saying if somebody is sick that all of a sudden the entire business has to come to a screeching halt. We're just saying, let's figure out a way together to manage that so that we're not being overworked and the customers are not suffering, and it's crazy the way that these companies look at what we're saying is the most fair and equitable way to handle a situation. And they're going, well, you just don't want us to make any money. You just want to shut everything down. No, absolutely nobody said that. Who wins if we shut the business down? We certainly don't win. So those are some of the proposals we are working on and hopefully asking for, and we'll get in that first collective bargaining agreement.
Fantastic. And so then let's spend the last few minutes on this, Adam's question about how do you deal, because look, right, we're worker advocates. We want the best work. Workers deserve more, right? This is kind of our shtick. But workers are people, and sometimes people are crazy. Like, they are weird. Sometimes people can be weird, right? Sometimes they can stir up stuff that really make you that can really cause issues in a campaign. A toxic coworker who is drama all the time, keeps petty interpersonal stuff stirred up, a snitch. What about when the toxic person is a steward or a building rep or an officer or, somebody on the organizing committee? How do we deal with conflict between workers, between union members? And Johnny, you've been quiet for a little bit, so I'll throw it to you for first.
Thank you. I feel like it could definitely speak to this because in our ongoing union campaign, we have a very, very vocal anti-union faction within our company. And dealing with them has been just an exercise in patience and understanding, because you don't want to alienate your coworkers. These are people that I still have to work with. Some of them I've even called my friends at some point. And so, always trying to, in the back of my mind, I always say I'm trying to remember that, I work with them, I respect them, or even, I may love some of my friends. And that once we move past this, we'll still have to work together. So that's like my broad answer. But directly, and I'm just going to be honest with you, sometimes you're just going to have to let some people go and move on. You might not be able to convince people that they need a union, or their views just may be so opposed or bizarre that you're like, this is not going anywhere. I've had to let some conversations go. They've gone into QAnon, conspiracy theory territory. And I'm just like, you know what? No, I am out of my depth a little bit, or I just strongly disagree. And I don't have the mental or emotional bandwidth to carry this conversation on. And you know what? That's okay. And I think you do yourself better service as an organizer when you say, this conversation isn't going to work. I may not be able to save this person. I can save the next person. And then another tactic that I use, and that we use, every organizer has a Slack or Discord or something like that, WhatsApp. I suggest someone else talk to them. Someone at the company speaks their language. And in a work group that has over 20 something thousand flight attendants in it, we're not all going to be the same. I'm very fortunate that I have a friend circle that somewhat believes the similar things that I do, but not all of my coworkers do. So in that case, I'm going to say, hey, you know what? You seem to be on the same wavelength as this person. Maybe you should try to talk to them. Maybe you can speak their language and see if you all can come to some type of meeting ground or terms, or just, progress them from wherever they are in whatever organizing conversation that you're having. But we have our snitches. We have people who are looking at our Facebook accounts to see what we said in 2015 and who are reporting us to the company. And I just have to think that, I'm trying to save them from themselves, I know it's a hero thing or whatever, and that may not be the best way to come at it. But if they're doing that, that means that there's something going on with them personally in their lives. It's not my job to dig it out or, find out what it is. I just have to let them do that and continue on with my organizing and forming a union, because that is the goal. And we're just going to save them from whatever negativity and nonsense that they're doing, and not let it derail the campaign. But you can't take on every single person. You just can't. It's impossible.
Exactly. Yeah. Does anybody else have anything they want to add to that?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about, so far we've been talking about what it means to speak to people who are like at the level of yes union, no union, or like I'm not in a union, I am in a union. One thing that's come up over the past few years, and especially as I've become more involved not just in my unit's politics, but in UAW national and regional politics, is also interpersonal conflict and interpersonal forms of harm that happen amongst union members, and how you manage that in maintaining your professional relationship that you have with these like colleagues and like union colleagues, like not even just work colleagues, but union colleagues, and confronting it and addressing it while also maintaining that relationship. Specifically, I think what comes to mind for me is sexism and racism as they are present. If they're present in society, that means they're present in unions. Within the UAW, like just a month ago at our conference at the UAW Constitutional Convention, I was mistaken for a different person who's of a different ethnic background, but who is also like an outspoken woman of color. And this has happened even before the conference, after the conference, like we just get mixed up all the time. And even though this is a microaggression, it's actually been a useful teaching experience to talk to my UAW brothers and sisters, which is like a language that's really common in the UAW, and talk about these subtle things that like, it's actually really important that you don't mix me up with my friend. I love her. I'm honored to be mistaken for her. She's beautiful. But what I also hear when you say that is that you're not paying attention to like each of our individuality, or like, something else that came up is realizing that some of the auto workers who are men would go around and shake the hands of everybody there, and then would assume that the women present were partners or wives and not in the UAW themselves, or like just not like literally not even speak to them, right? And as the UAW grows, as it moves into other sectors, and also as capitalism changes, as it has historically and it will continue to do, like women and non-binary people have a role in the labor movement, and you just like can never make an assumption about why someone is there. And so those have been difficult conversations. There's also like conversations about reform and what the role of a union is. Like, is it a service union? Is it a business union? This is like Union 201. So we could get into that at another level at another time. But to have that conversation about like conflict within a union, and like, you might disagree with someone about this political strategy, but you can't use interpersonal harm as a way to address that. So like another instance came up where someone was, offering a case, in favor of like business unionism, and the caucus that I was a part of, which is more rank and file unionism, was using language that just like came down to ad hominem attacks that also aligned with like historical misogynoir, right? And that's just wrong. And it's like not okay. And so finding ways to say, we're going to keep this at the level of political strategy and political difference, and not let the things that plague our society also plague like the way that we manage conflict in our union. Like that it feels important to say, because harm happens, like conflict is going to happen. It's how we choose to approach it and resolve it.
Exactly. Yeah. It's important to, it's important to recognize that, yeah, people are going to have differences, and there is a correct, like there's a proper way to have disagreements, political disagreements that doesn't resort to those types of things.
The attorneys at Maples, Tucker & Jacobs have stood with the working people of Alabama for over 40 years, providing skilled legal representation for your workplace injury claims. When you are injured on the job, it can be a scary time. The attorneys at Maples, Tucker & Jacobs have the experience to guide you through the process to make sure that you and your family are properly taken care of and your rights are protected. If you need help, call the attorneys at Maples, Tucker & Jacobs at 855-617-9333 or visit online at www.mtnj.com. No representation is made that the quality of legal services provided is greater than the quality of legal services provided by other law firms.
Support for the Valley Labor Report comes from the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers Union. Learn more by visiting www.ifpte.org.
Are you looking for a better future, a career that can have you set for life, and to be a part of something that's bigger than yourself? If you are, then consider a skilled trades apprenticeship with the International Union of Painters and Allied Trades. The work of IUPAT is all around us, from the industrial painters who work on the bridges to drywall finishers, floor coverers, the glazers who install the glass in our skylines, and so much more. With an IUPAT apprenticeship, you earn while you learn and receive benefits while learning the trade, including a pension. We provide world-class education free of charge. That's right, no student debt. Our starting salaries for apprentices that graduate is above the national median salary with benefits for entire families. And you have the flexibility to take your trade wherever you'd like in the country to work. IUPAT District Council 77 covers our entire region, so give Adam Booth a call at 205-603-3142 for more information. Again, that phone number is 205-603-3142. Come build a better future with us today and join IUPAT.
We're the nurses, firefighters, and claims representatives that help keep our government services running. We respond to natural disasters. We care for our nation's veterans, and we investigate discrimination in the workplace. We are federal and D.C. government workers, and we are proud to serve the American people. Working in more than 70 agencies across the government, we know we can fulfill our mission because our union has our back. Learn more at afge.org. Paid for by the American Federation of Government Employees, AFL-CIO.
Since 1889, the National Association of Letter Carriers has protected the rights of city carriers as they deliver the mail and offer support for their community. The Alabama State Association of Letter Carriers makes their legislative voices heard when it comes to issues involving the U.S. Postal Service and the working members of the union. The National Association of Letter Carriers has been longtime supporters of the Muscular Dystrophy Association and the Stamp Out Hunger Food Drive. This message is sponsored by the Alabama Association of Letter Carriers. To learn more, visit NALC.org. Unite Here is also a supporter of the Valley Labor Report. They are a labor union that represents 300,000 working people across Canada and the United States. Their members work in the hotel, gaming, food service, manufacturing, textile, distribution, laundry, transportation, and airport Industries. You can learn more about Unite Here at unitehere.org.
Come on, you poor workers, good news to you I'll tell, how the good old union has come in here to dwell.
I have a Unions 101 presentation that I give new employees at work, so I'm going to I have adapted some of that a little bit for the radio, and I'm going to give it to you here. We're going to be talking about, just super basic, what even is a union, right? What is a union? How do they work? Why do people want to join a union? How can you join a union? How can you get involved? How do you bargain a first contract? We're going to be going through all of that kind of stuff, obviously at a very high level. Any of these kind of topics, you could really spend hours on any of them, but just for the one-on-one level, we'll be able to do that in about 30 minutes. So, starting off with just the bare basics. What is a union, right? It's a very basic question, and it's something that, actually a lot of people are not going to be able to answer if you ask them this question. They're not going to be able to answer with any sort of level of coherence. Sometimes even union members are not going to be able to tell you what a union is because they've never actually thought about it very much. They just know that it's something that they're a part of, that is good for them, that gives them good things, that is the reason that they have, better wages, better benefits, and things like that. But they don't really know actually, logistically what is a union. And so the definition that I think makes the most sense is that a union is just a group of people who work together, who are organizing to make their workplace better. That's really it in a nutshell, right? And I know that, you can have an election and then the government will recognize you, and government recognition goes along with forcing the employer to negotiate with you in good faith, but people were organizing unions before it was legal to organize unions. People were organizing unions when it was expressly illegal to organize unions, right? People were being arrested and murdered by the state for organizing unions, right? And so I have always felt very strongly that it would not be honorable to their memory to say that you are only a union if you win an election and the government recognizes you, right? And you get all of the benefits that come with that. I think that you're a union if you come together and you say you're a union, right? Along with that, when you have people that are coming together to make their workplace better, you get that power of solidarity and mutual aid. Additionally, unions in this country are democratic. They're actually mandatorily democratic by law. There is a certain level of accountability that you have to have. Otherwise, you will get, the government taking action against you, and that's never good. So there are laws surrounding the governance of unions, and there is a certain level of accountability and democracy that unions have to have baked into them. Otherwise, they do run afoul of the law. Unions also give, by virtue of the fact that it is workers coming together and organizing collectively, it gives you power on the job. It gives you power and a collective voice to influence employers and policymakers. We'll get to that in a moment. But yeah, that's it in a nutshell. What is a union? It's two or more folks working together to make their workplace better. It is solidarity, it is democracy, it is power, it is mutual aid. That is what a union is, like theoretically, philosophically, right? But then, what is a union? If you think about that and you think about, like, what am I going to see when I see a union? Or more accurately, who am I going to see when I see a union? And specifically, what are the kind of people that you see in unions? And what people think when they think about unions is they think about, hard hat wearing construction workers. White guys with hard hats on construction jobs. That's all that they think of when they think of unions, or maybe a coal miner, right? And actually, those people are, there are a lot of folks in unions that work jobs like that, but that is not the majority of the labor movement. In fact, 46% of union workers are women. 36% of union workers are people of color. And this is a fun one. 42% of union workers have a bachelor's degree or higher. A lot of people think that you don't need a union if you have a bachelor's degree, if you're smart, if you work at a computer, right? They think that that's not necessary, that you don't need a union if you have one of those jobs or if you are educated. And that's just not true. And, it turns out that union workers know that because fully almost half of union workers have a bachelor's degree, right? So it's really important to, that really goes to show that anybody and everybody can and should be part of a union. 40% of union workers work in education or health services. Actually, the largest union in the country is the teachers union, is a teachers union. There are multiple, but the National Education Association with 3 million members is the largest union in the United States of America. 21% of union workers work in transportation, utilities, or manufacturing. That's where, those are some of the more kind of stereotypical union industries. And you can see with them only occupying 21% of it, they're only part of it, right? They're a big part and they're an important part, but it's only part of it. Anybody can be in a union. If you work for a wage, if you have a boss, then you can join a union, right? That's really the long and short of it. I think that it's worth going through that to kind of dispel some of the myths around who today's union workers are. So with that out of the way, we've gone over philosophically what is a union. And we've gone over, physically, like who are we going to see when we see a union? Now let's go back to some philosophy and let's think about how unions work. I talked about how, unions are about power, but let's dwell on that a little bit more, right? The reason that power from collective action and collective organization is important is because the relationship between you and your employer is not one of equals. Being in a union fixes that imbalance. And it's really intuitive if you think about it, because you know that if you are unhappy with your working conditions and you leave, basically no matter who you are, no matter how great you are at your job, the workplace is going to be able to go along fine the next day. Maybe it takes a little while to replace you. Maybe they're able to replace you the next day. But if you alone quit your job, that's not a deal breaker for any company, right? If you alone engage in some sort of protest, if you alone write some sort of letter, maybe because your boss just doesn't like conflict, or maybe even your boss is nice, if you, engage in those kinds of actions individually, maybe you'll be able to resolve it, but maybe you won't. And if you are able to resolve it, it's not because, you have that much power. It's just because, by the whim of your boss, right? But if everybody in your workplace got up and said, we are not working until this is fixed, we are not working until this is changed, well, you've stopped production, right? Your workplace simply cannot function if you do not have everybody working. There's a question about where does value come from? Does value come from labor or does value come from capital, right? And obviously, if you think about that, if you think about what happens when you remove all of the labor from an equation, then, the equation stops. If you remove all the capital from an equation, labor can create more capital, right? If you think about a manufacturing facility and you remove all of the capital-intensive goods, the machines that you need to do those sorts of manufacturing, you can create those machines again through labor, right? But those machines, which are capital, and capital is really just dead labor, those machines cannot create more labor. They have to have labor to create value, right? So labor is the source of all value. When I say labor creates all wealth, I very much mean that labor creates all wealth. Okay? Capital does not create wealth. Capital is dead labor. That's all it is. So, back to, how does this power work? If everybody in your workplace protests, if everybody in your workplace stands up and says, we're not working until this problem is fixed, well, then by golly, your boss is going to have to fix the problem. And that's the power that we're talking about. It doesn't even have to escalate all the way to a strike or even to a job action, but just having everybody pushing in one direction, everybody working for the same thing gives you power. It gives you much more power than you would have on your own. And that is what being in a union does. It fixes the imbalance. And that's where our strength comes from. And whether we change conditions through grievances, through job actions, or through political pressure, if we are not together, we don't have power. Right? And that's how unions work. Along those lines of being together, of having power collectively, we have dues. Dues is one of the first things that anti-union folks will try to talk about to try to make people scared of unions. They'll say that unions only want your dues. You'll get the same as you get without a union. You just won't have to pay the dues if you don't unionize. So don't unionize. Dues are bad. Dues are so bad, wouldn't you hate to pay money to a union, et cetera, right? But union dues are very important. And it's not because unions are a business and we're just trying to grow and we want, it's just for the sake of itself, right? Union dues are important because they sustain the organization that is responsible for bringing power to working people. We do not, as workers, we are not individually wealthy, and we cannot, just on a dime, drop thousands of dollars for any reason, right? And so that's why it's important for everybody to pitch in a little bit in timely increments so that we can be able to have these types of resources, right? Because our employers, whether they are private sector employers or whether they're the government, our employers really have more or less kind of unlimited funds that they can do with what they want, particularly as it relates to fighting us. When we think about the popular organizing campaigns that we see in the news a lot, Starbucks and Amazon, and how they pay these union busters, hundreds of dollars an hour to convince us that we don't need a union. Workers don't have those resources, right? And so that's why we have to pool our resources together so that we can have resources that can help us to organize and to educate us. Those funds educate officers. They send us to trainings to help us learn the law, to help us learn how to organize better, to help us learn how to, negotiate some negotiating best practices, grievance best practices, et cetera, et cetera. And they also fund officer salaries or, pizza parties or things like that the union might have. They're very important, and I have, been a union dues payer, obviously, for the better part of a decade now, and I don't regret a cent of it. It's like $21 a pay period. It's like $42 a month. I don't regret 1 cent of it, and if you're a union member, you really shouldn't either. Additionally, budgets are approved democratically by members. People talk about how Maybe members don't like the way that their dues money are being spent. Well, unions have budgets that have to be approved by the members. They have treasurer's reports that have to be approved by the members. And so, in my union specifically, it's going to be different. The exact mechanisms are going to be different from union to union. But in my union specifically, every January, the budget committee creates a budget, and then they present that budget to the general meeting, and we painstakingly review that budget. And it is in my opinion, I think people spend way too much time on it. And I would be much more apt to just, approve it and go on. But, look, that's democracy in practice. And we really do. We spend hours on the budget and approving it for the year. And then even after we approve the budget, every single month, we get a treasurer's report at the meeting where we see every red cent that comes in and comes out of our union's bank account, and we approve it or we disapprove it. And if we have questions about charges, then we get to ask questions about it. And we can choose to not approve the treasurer's report and say, hey, you got to go back and fix something. We don't approve that expenditure. That wasn't in the budget. You got to fix this, right? You do not have that kind of power basically in any other organization that you can be a part of. You certainly don't have that kind of power at your job, right? And so that's a really cool thing about unions, about the level of democracy and accountability that unions have.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
So, we've gone through what a union is and how it works. And so we're going to continue on into bargaining a contract. Okay. So I said that, when you have a union election, and if the union wins the election, then in the United States, there is a requirement on the employer to negotiate a contract in good faith with the union as the bargaining representative of the workers. And so once a union wins an election, or if a contract expires and you're renegotiating the contract, then typically, what you're going to see happen is the union is going to be surveying the members, asking questions about work and the workplace, what you like, what you would like to see change, what kind of raises you think would be appropriate, stuff like that. And then you will have, the union will select the bargaining committee. This is done in different ways in different unions. Some unions appoint the bargaining committee. Some unions elect the bargaining committee. My preference would be elections, but, I'm kind of very pro-small. I'm a small d Democrat in that way, right? I like democracy, but not all unions do that. But once you have the negotiating committee will take a look at the member surveys and try to identify some key proposals. And then the union negotiating committee and the company negotiating committee will exchange proposals. They will negotiate. And then they'll try to come to an agreement. Now, sometimes you're not going to be able to come to an agreement, or you're not going to be able to come to an agreement quickly. And so you might have to take a vote to strike. And now this is something that another thing that anti-union types like to do is they like to fearmonger about strikes. What they won't tell you is that you have a say in whether or not you go on strike, right? You have to vote to authorize a strike before the union can call a strike. And that's what happens anytime you see a strike. It's because the members have authorized it, right? So if you don't think that you need to strike over an issue, then you can vote not to strike over an issue. If there's like an impasse, then the negotiating committee might request strike authorization. They'll have the vote. Presumably, the vote comes back yes. We empower the negotiating committee to strike if necessary. And then you might see a strike. And that is something that will, put some more pressure on the company to negotiate a contract. Once you get a tentative agreement, the tentative agreement will be shared with the members, and the members will be able to review it and take a look at it, and then they'll be able to vote yay or nay. If the members like the contract, then they'll be able to vote yes and accept it, and then there you go. You have a new contract, and you have new conditions of employment. If you vote no, then it's back to the negotiating table to try to fix whatever it was that the employees, the members of the union, were unhappy with. Some things that you might see in a union contract are, really there's the sky is the limit. The Chicago Teachers Union is requesting housing for students in their contract negotiations, which is really, really cool. And I hope that they're able to see that. I hope that they're able to get that in this round of contract negotiations. But you're going to see things like wages, insurance, retirement. Union members are basically some of the only people left in the country that have pensions. That's probably worth mentioning. Some health and safety procedures. You have just cause for discipline, which is a really important thing. If you are not in a union workplace, you do not have a collective bargaining agreement, you are an at-will employee. That's anywhere in the country. You're an at-will employee, which means that you can be fired for any reason or no reason at all, which I think is BS, and I think we should outlaw it. I don't think that's a good state of affairs, but nevertheless, that is the state of affairs that exists, unless you have a union contract where and you have a just cause provision in your contract, which will, lay out the procedures for discipline, and presumably you'll have some sort of progressive discipline in there. And you'll have, criteria that you can be punished for or ultimately terminated for. You'll also see, provisions about time off, scheduling, how overtime works. You'll have education and training, fair transfer procedures, staffing provisions, diversity provisions, seniority provisions, things like this. Seniority is another thing that for some reason employers think is a good way to, lambast unions, and it's something that I've never really understood, because seniority seems to me like it is one of the most common sense things that you could have in a contract. Well, some of the reasons that are given for not liking seniority is that, if I work harder than this 65, 70-year-old guy and I produce more, then I should be able to make more money than him, right? Why shouldn't I? And that just doesn't make sense to me. And I think that, if people were to think about it for more than 2 seconds, they would agree. But, if this guy is 67, 70 years old, has been working for this company for 50 years, then no doubt he also had times where he was 20 and working really good and was very, very productive, right? But he sacrificed those years of his life, the best years, most of his waking life. He sacrificed to a company. And so, I think he deserves actually a lot, like a hell of a lot for that sacrifice. And yes, I think that means he should make more money than a 25-year-old who is more productive. He should have a priority over a 25-year-old who is more productive in terms of, reductions in force or layoffs or things like this. Right? You should have seniority should get you a lot, right? I think that makes sense. Now, the important thing about a union contract is that it's negotiated by the union, which is made up of the workers. So if workers in a certain workplace don't agree with me that seniority is an important thing, they could outvote me and not put much weight on seniority. And that's the beauty of democracy, right? If people in some workplace say, I don't care about seniority, I just want to be, compensated for productivity, well, I think that's dumb, but you could put that in your union contract if you wanted, right? It's totally up to you. That's the beauty of democracy and the beauty of a union and what you can do in a union. I think that's great, even if I disagree with it. So now we get to contract enforcement. Okay, so we've bargained a contract, we've got a great contract, we've got seniority, but, now comes enforcement. Because if you don't enforce it, it's just a piece of paper. And so one of the first lines of defense are going to be union stewards. Stewards are trained in, grievance procedures. They're sent off for union trainings to learn about labor law, to learn about, how to do investigations, to, you get all sorts of training as a union steward, or you should. Stewards are the ones that are going to file grievances when a contract is violated and hold management to account. And ultimately, the grievance procedure typically ends in like binding arbitration or something like that. So, having stewards and having active stewards and having an active membership who reports to stewards regularly is very important to enforcing the contract. Because, you could theoretically have the best contract in the world, but if you don't make sure, if you don't stop management when they try to violate it, it's just a piece of paper. It doesn't mean anything. The bottom line is that without a union, management controls all the decisions. In non-union workplaces, management has the right to set or change each worker's pay, benefits, working conditions at any time for any reason without consultation. They also have the right to fire workers for any reason or no reason. Right? I think that's BS. I think that you shouldn't have to put up with that. And that's why I think that, everybody should join a union. But nevertheless, that's not the state of affairs that we are in right now. So in a union workplace, you have a contract that you have negotiated and that neither you nor management can change on a whim. You have to negotiate changes in the contract. I think that's really beautiful. Now, speaking of enforcing the contract, some people think that unions only help bad workers, right? That's a real misconception, I think. One reason that it's a misconception is that most people who actually come to the union and need help never think they are going to be the ones who need help. Every single person that I have taken through the grievance process to a person has said something along the lines of, I never thought it would be me. Right. I always thought that I worked great. I've always had a great relationship with my supervisor. I always do good work. But, now this issue has risen and I can't seem to find relief. And that's actually the situation that most people who have to come to the union for help find themselves in. In addition to that, unions can only enforce the contract or make change that the membership is behind, right? So management is never going to agree to a contract that does not allow them to discipline or terminate a worker who is really harming production, right? You're just never going to get a contract like that. Management would never agree to it. So anytime that a union gets an employee their job back, they were able to do that because management didn't follow the contract, right? So that's an important thing for people to recognize when they feel like, unions are only helping the bad employees. The union is only able to enforce the contract or make change that the membership is behind, right? Members don't like working with unproductive coworkers, right? That's something that nobody likes, to work with somebody who is not carrying their weight. So if you are, a worker, you want to have somebody next to you that you don't feel like you have to do their job for them. And so they're not even going to ask for a contract that doesn't allow you to discipline workers because they don't want that either. They want, they're going to want a contract where management can discipline and can, build up a productive workforce. Additionally, a lot of times if you show me a bad worker, actually, I'll be able to just show you a worse boss, right? Because management has a job. That job is training and supervision. And a lot of times, if people aren't productive, people aren't able to do the job that they're supposed to, it's because they haven't gotten the adequate training. And so that's an important thing to recognize, I think. So there you go. That is kind of the introduction to unions that I have prepared today. We figured it would be a good time to do a similar segment on something a little more advanced than that, and that is contract negotiations, union contract negotiations. One of the problems that I see with education around unions is again just that people really do not have any kind of comprehension on even what a union is, and a lot of times, or if they understand what a union is, they don't understand how unions negotiate contracts, right? We hear all of this talk about big labor, about union bosses, and the way that especially in corporate and right-wing media want to portray unions is as these far-off institutions that are going to tell you as a worker in Alabama or wherever else you are, these institutions that are far away that you don't have a hand in, they're going to tell you how everything works. They're going to tell you what your contract is going to be. You're going to get no say in it. They're going to tell you to go on strike. You're not going to get a say in it. And so, you know, in addition to this just being a generic kind of educational segment, we want it to be a myth dispelling segment as well. So Adam is actually in the middle of contract negotiations right now, so I figured he would be a good person to talk to about this. Adam, what would be the first thing, either when unions begin contract renegotiations or when unions are bargaining their first contract immediately after winning a union election or being voluntarily recognized as you were at your company? What are some of the first steps that its members take when they are beginning the negotiation process?
Well, I would say one of the first steps would be figuring out your bargaining team, your negotiators who are going to be serving at the table negotiating this agreement. And so typically unions do it differently. Every union has their own method in terms of how someone becomes on the bargaining team and what that looks like. But it is typically a democratic process that, in my case, we voted for who we wanted to serve on the bargaining team. And these were our rank and file coworkers who we want to represent us. Depending on the size of the unit, it may vary on how many folks are required per department or per certain types of job classification. You know, in my case, it's a smaller bargaining unit. There's only 14 people, so we have a rather small bargaining team. But, you know, I've seen bargaining teams that are much, much larger and do have that diversity of skill sets, because if you're in a larger workplace and you represent all sorts of different types of workers, it's really good to have those different voices reflected, because at the end of the day, this contract is going to cover everybody in the bargaining unit, regardless of their job. And so you have to be mindful of that, right? You have to be able to look out not just for yourself if you are on that bargaining team, but for the entire unit, all the workers that you're there representing. Some unions will also include staff or officers, maybe an
attorney.
Potentially. So, you know, again, it just varies on the negotiations, who you're up against in terms of the company, how big of an employer this is. All those vary and factor into it. But, you know, in my case, we have workers from the rank and file who were elected by the rank and file. We also have a staff rep from our union, and we also have an officer from our union. Combined, you know, we have quite a bit of experience and perspectives to bring to the table that's really helpful.
I want to emphasize the importance of typically, now, you know, it is true that not every union is the same, and there are going to be some unions where negotiating committees are primarily appointed positions from the union leadership. But we'll talk about later how even if you don't, as a rank and file member, get to elect your bargaining committee, you can still have influence over the process. But typically, you know, you do see elected positions on the bargaining committee. It is not uncommon. I don't know if it's the majority of bargaining committees. I don't have data on that, but it is a very common thing that you get to elect from the people that you work beside who is going to be on the negotiating committee across the table from management. So these are people that you work on the line beside, works in the cube next to you, drives a truck on the same shift as you, you know, whatever your situation is. These are people who know what it is like to work under the current contract if you're renegotiating a contract, or what it's been like to work before you unionized if you're negotiating your first contract. And I think that's something that is really cool that you do not get if you are in a non-union workplace, right? You don't get to elect people that are going to be negotiating the contract. You don't even get a say. You don't even get a contract. It's all up to management what they do or don't do, and it's all at their discretion. Even if you have a great job and your manager is great and you have good benefits and your working conditions are great, that can all literally be taken away tomorrow at the discretion of your employer without your input, consent, or consultation. Emphasizing that, I think, is really important. And so once we've got the bargaining team either elected or appointed or some combination of the two, and also just a reminder that even if they're appointed positions, the person who appoints them is elected one way or another. Right.
There's democratic accountability at various levels. Right. That does vary from union to union, and some are more democratic and some are less. But absolutely, there is input that you have as a union member into this process that you just simply don't have as a non-union worker.
And so once the negotiations committee has been selected or elected, whatever the process is, one of the next things that will happen during these negotiations or before negotiations begin is that the people on the bargaining committee will get training. And in some cases, like a significant amount of training. I know the machinists, for instance, they will send their negotiations committee for 1 to 2 weeks, full-time bargaining preparations, learning about relevant law, learning about relevant case law, studying their contracts, studying other contracts in the industry, studying negotiation techniques, how to behave at the table for, like just the interpersonal, like ways to try to, get the best deal at the table through those kind of rhetorical tricks and things like that. I mean, some unions do more training than others, but because of my experience with the machinists and having been so close to David Story for so long, I know that they get a significant amount of training, and you got at least some training as a member of the bargaining committee at your workplace, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Got training. And I also want to just point out part of the reason our team is the dynamic it is with an officer as well as a staff rep is because it is a first contract. And so maybe holding our hand is putting it a little too strongly, but the union is a little more engaged in directly in ensuring that the team is equipped to pull off a successful first contract, whereas it may be a little bit more driven by the bargaining committee, the rest of the bargaining committee moving forward. So that's something to factor in, but there's absolutely a lot of training that goes into this. Every union does it different, but you have to prepare, you have to do your homework, you have to learn how to do this. It's a variety of skill sets are involved, and it's not something that necessarily comes natural to everybody, or it's not something you necessarily have practice for per se. In my previous union, the National Staff Organization, something that we did was these coordinated bargaining councils where we would meet regionally and compare our contracts. And that's something we would do as part of our training was we would all bust out our contracts and we would have charts where we would chart the gains and the losses per article, right? And look and see, well, where did we make gains or losses in wages? What about, vacation leave? What about retirement contributions, health insurance, all this? Training is a big part of it. And then you're probably about to ask me about how we get input from the membership, which is also a big early stage.
Yeah, that's the next step. So we've got the negotiations committee. They're trained up. They're experts now. They know everything there is to know about negotiations and labor law. Maybe that's putting it too strongly. But after all of that has happened, or even sometimes these things are running on parallel paths, there are multiple things that unions and negotiations committees do to try to get the pulse of the membership, try to figure out what the priorities of the people in the relevant bargaining unit are. And so what are some of those things?
Right. Again, it varies based on the size of the unit. A very small unit, you could have one-on-one conversations with everyone, right? And get a lot of feedback that way. A lot of times bargaining committees do surveys and they will survey the membership, and that gives you some hard data to work with. That's helpful. I know in our case, we use proposal form or input forms, and folks literally gave their input on Google Docs and sent it to us, and we collected those and analyzed those. So there's various ways that, the bargaining team is going to collect data, collect input from the membership, but that is a really important way to engage as a member. Like, if there are things that bother you, here is a good chance to say something about it. if there are things you want to see improved. It's different with the first contract because we're coming up with everything, right? It's based on our status quo of not having a union, not having a contract, versus if you're already working under a contract, you may have a better idea of like what language has been giving you problems, what language you'd like to see changed, because something else is going to be feeding this feedback loop is grievances that you've had over the past few years, over the life of the contract cycle. So that's also feeding your input. So you're getting surveys, you're having one-on-ones, you're doing other forms of input to get feelings and thoughts and opinions and questions and concerns from the membership to drive your negotiations. And then where you already have a contract in place, you're also looking at the grievances that you've been dealing with, because that's also going to drive your negotiations and where you need to put your focus. If there are particular articles or sections of the contract that are continually coming up as controversies in the workplace, there's constantly disputes about the interpretation, that's something you're going to want to address. Typically, the bargaining team, that's how they develop their proposals, is based on that input. That's how they know what to do. That's how they know what to prioritize. Right? If 10 members all want a pay raise, but only one member really cares about more vacation, you're going to focus more on the pay raise than the vacation, right? That's just kind of the way that works. And so, there is a lot of feedback loop going in with that process, but that's what really shapes you going into the negotiations. Like, you have your membership input, you have your history of grievances, and so you have some idea of your priorities that you want to tackle.
David mentioned when we discussed this on the program 3 years ago that sometimes among the negotiations committee, the discussions about what to prioritize or, what issue they cared about, sometimes these discussions can get heated, even just among the negotiations committee or the bargaining committee or union members, because, this is your life. It's really kind of a gross state of affairs that we live in a so-called democracy or republic or whatever. We're supposed to have some amount of input over the conditions of our lives, but the place where we spend the majority of our waking lives, at minimum for most of us 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, we don't have any rights. But in union workplaces, you have some amount of say. And so when you're discussing this kind of stuff, you're discussing the conditions under which you're going to spend the majority of your waking life. And so if you have a disagreement, that can be very frustrating. You're like, I want this to happen so that I don't have to deal with this problem for the next 3 years, and you don't agree with me? What the hell? What's going on there? So that can be very frustrating. And so what David said was that, whenever they had these kind of heated discussions or debates or whatever among the committee, they would just take a look at the survey, right? That they would point to the survey, say, look, I understand that you're heated about this, you really want this, but only 3% of the membership agrees with you. We don't have the mandate to go really hard on this issue at the table. And so once you've got a really good pulse of the membership, once you figure out how they feel about something that sometimes unions will do, and, sometimes it's a little different from union to union, but sometimes unions will do whole proposed contracts. Like they will just, they'll create a contract on their own that they say, this is what our ideal contract would look like. That theoretically, management could just sign at the bottom and then on day one, negotiations are over. But, I'm not aware of anything like that happening. But, sometimes they do that and they're able to kind of make a campaign out of some of the really big issues. Like you said, a lot of times wages and raises are really important to folks. And so they'll highlight the results of the surveys and they say, based on this, we want in the contract a 35% wage increase over the next 3 or 4 years. And so that's something to basically send back to the membership for one more kind of gut check about, okay, look, we've heard from everybody. The negotiations committee, we've heard from everybody. Here's where we think that you all are. Let us know what you think about it. And then I've even seen some people go a step further to ratify that proposal before the negotiations even start. I've seen some unions do that. They said the negotiations committee creates a proposal, basically an ideal contract. They send it to the membership for approval, and then they take that to the bargaining table with the company.
There's so many different ways you can approach it, but like you said, the feedback is really important. And again, I want to emphasize the membership involvement in that process is really, really important. Is that saying that, if you give your input, it's going to automatically be reflected in the final contract? Obviously not, right? A lot can happen between the moment you give your input on that survey and what actually comes out in a final agreement for you to vote on. But if you're not giving your input, you're not helping your team. And you're not helping yourself either, because if there are issues that are relevant to you, you need to speak up on those, and you need to share those with folks and let folks know how it impacts you. And maybe it impacts others, maybe it doesn't. That's something for us to figure out. But you do need to speak up, and you do need to be involved, and you do need to follow along in this process. And I know we'll talk later about once the negotiations start and providing updates and that sort of thing. But yeah, you need to be engaged throughout the process.
Right.
Even if you're not on the committee, everybody has a part to play, because the management will also know how involved people are. They will have a sense of like how engaged the membership is with bargaining. That creates leverage on their end sometimes. So, that's something for us to consider.
We have a comment in the chat from Steve. One problem is when the union asks members to submit proposals, but then the members don't know which proposals were actually brought to the table. And, that's one of those issues where we'll be describing kind of a generalized approach that a lot of unions do actually take. But like we were going to say throughout, some unions are going to do things a little bit differently, maybe a little bit more democratically than we're describing, and some a little bit less democratically. But it's also important to remember the mechanisms for accountability and democratic responsibility of the people on these committees or in elected leadership, that members do have the opportunity to say, if you are in a union and you don't like the level of democracy that you're seeing in your negotiations, you can make that known to the negotiations committee directly during negotiations. And you can also agitate for change in future contract negotiations or in future leadership elections to try to see increased involvement and increased participation from the membership during these negotiations. But yeah, it's certainly a problem sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Any need for improvement in your contract negotiations process, whether it's transparency, democracy, input, whatever the situation may be, is an opportunity to organize, an opportunity to engage democratically and try to make things better. A lot of times people get burnout or get jaded and they get upset and they just sort of unplug. And I think that's the wrong approach, because that doesn't fix anything. If you don't like the way the negotiations are going, then say something and speak up and try to change that. Talk to your other members about that. See who else feels the same way. Can you bring emotion to the next meeting, right? Can you put something on the floor? Can you make something happen? So that would be my challenge to folks, is always be thinking how you can make things better and how you can engage democratically with your coworkers, your fellow members, and try to make things better. It is a great responsibility to be on these negotiations. And I think most people who go into it realize that, and it weighs heavy on their heart. And it is a lot of work. It is a ton of work. Even in my situation where I have a very friendly management on the other side of the table, it's still a lot of work, right? To get the language right, to come up with proposals, to keep track of counters and counters to the counters and all that kind of stuff. It is a lot of work.
Right.
But you do have a responsibility as the membership to hold your folks accountable. So I would say be engaged in the process, and if there are shortcomings, then speak up about that.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
And so then once we've got the surveying, taking the pulse of the membership, maybe creating ideal proposals that the membership can see, then we do actually get to the negotiations table. You get to the bargaining table with management. What do some of those first days negotiating with management look like? One of the first things that you negotiate is ground rules, right?
Right, yes. And my understanding is that ground rules are not necessarily something you have to do per se, but it's something that is typically done, and that's going to cover when and where will you meet. Will you meet virtually? Will you meet in person? Will it be at the union hall? Will it be at, the company's spot? Will it be at a neutral location? Those are the sort of things you'll come up with in ground rules. You may also discuss what will be shared coming off of the table. And that can be a tricky situation, what you agree to not talk about, because some unions will enter into really binding confidentiality where almost nothing is shared, almost no updates can be provided. And then you have other situations that are totally open. There is no real guardrails there in terms of what's shared and what's not. So it can really vary wildly. And those ground rules are part of the bigger strategy and part of the bigger game that you're playing. sometimes you may get frustrated with your team to say, well, why did you agree to this in ground rules? Well, maybe there was a reason because we were building goodwill to win on the first proposal, right? There's all sorts of reasons why you would agree to something in the moment to potentially move things forward elsewhere, because, it is a give and take process. You're not going to get everything that you want more than likely, but you should also not lose on everything either. Right. For decades, a lot of our unions were really just managing concessions. And we're coming into these contracts with the expectation of concessions and walked away with concessions. And that's just not a long-term recipe for success, obviously. The extent to which you can win things versus lose things is very dynamic and based on the employer and the situation you're in and the union strength and the economy and all that. But yeah, those are all different things that you're balancing. So the ground rules is something early. And then at that point, you're going to start actually passing proposals. My assumption would be that in most cases, the union's going to be passing more than management will be. That depends, I guess, on your situation, but just to generalize a little bit, management will certainly propose something called management rights. That will certainly get passed by management, but everything else is often going to be up to you on the union side to try to make gains and make progress. And typically you'll have proposals or articles that are based on certain categories of your employment in terms of wages, healthcare benefits, retirement benefits, vacation days, sick leave. You'll tackle these different topics and just go back and forth, passing language back and forth, refining it, trying to find some language that you can agree to.
And then after you're passing proposals back and forth, and you mentioned that, one of the ground rules that you might negotiate at the beginning, that some unions do negotiate, are these really binding NDAs, non-disclosure agreements that really do limit the amount of updates that you can provide to your members about how negotiations are going. I think you and I obviously favor less restrictive NDAs if we're going to sign them at all. I think I would probably lean towards not signing an NDA at all, especially with your members. Maybe you can kind of play it by ear whether or not you feel like it's important to retain the right to talk to the media. That's maybe a little bit more tricky, but particularly being able to update your members on negotiations, I think is important. And I think, members appreciate that kind of stuff, those updates and being kept in the loop. But as you're negotiating, passing proposals back and forth, if there's not anything else during that process that you feel like is important to emphasize, what are some of the things that happen towards the end of negotiations?
Well, I can only speak from my experiences. What we have been doing is or at least right now in the contract negotiations I'm in, we'll reach a TA on certain proposals, a tentative agreement on certain proposals. And that's not to say that we can't change our mind later. We can, but for the moment, both sides have agreed to language on these proposals. And eventually, hopefully, we get to that point where we have a TA or tentative agreement on everything, on all the proposals that are necessary for the contract, or all the articles in your existing contract, or that needs to be added to the contract. And once you have that tentative agreement, as in both sides have informally agreed, the negotiations team as well as the management's negotiations team have both signed off on it. At that point, the negotiations team will have to have a meeting of itself and discuss how they handle that. In some unions, the bargaining team will officially recommend passage. In some, they will just present it without a real judgment call. So that's going to vary. Even if your bargaining team recommends that you do or don't vote down an agreement, sometimes the bargaining team present you an agreement that they themselves don't want you to vote for. That happens. Maybe it was the best deal they could get out of the negotiations, but it's still not really a good deal. They want the membership to send them back, or they want the membership to threaten a strike. Whatever the situation may be, you as the member typically are going to have the ultimate decision, because once there is a tentative agreement in full available, often the member then has a direct vote on whether to ratify it and make it an official contract approved by both sides.
That's important to emphasize that the bargaining committee really ultimately does not have the final say in what the contract is. They will send it back to the members for a ratification vote. As they send it back, they can opt to recommend ratification. They can opt not to say anything about whether they recommend or not. And they can also say, here's the best thing we could have gotten at the bargaining table without a strike. We don't recommend this. We recommend you vote against it and potentially recommend you strike. And that's the next thing. So let's say that you get a tentative agreement. The bargaining committee says you shouldn't ratify it. The membership doesn't ratify it. And then either at this point, or a lot of times actually before negotiations even start, you will hold a strike authorization vote, right? Which will empower the bargaining committee to, when they feel like is necessary, call a strike. If they feel like the company is not bargaining in good faith or they're not moving as much as they should, a strike authorization vote, if passed, will allow the bargaining committee to call a strike. And so that might happen after you reject a tentative agreement. A lot of unions do it even before the negotiations begin. But if you have a failed tentative agreement and a passed strike authorization vote, then at that point, you could potentially see the union threaten to strike.
That's right. You could also see both sides scramble to go back to the table and try to work out a deal. And maybe management suddenly sees the writing on the wall that a strike is looming and they change their posture. So that's often a possibility. And then it's worth pointing out, in some sectors, you can't strike legally, right? In some sectors, it may be that, or in some situations, it may be that it has to go to arbitration, perhaps. But what you're describing is probably the typical private sector situation. So yeah, either it's going to be ratified by the membership, and in which case, woohoo, you got a new contract, and hopefully it was a good one. Or it's rejected. At that point, a strike is on the table. Typically, a strike authorization vote may take a bigger majority of your members to vote for it. So that's something to monitor, is what is the vote tally. When you see a union and they have like a 95, 97, 98% strike authorization vote heading into negotiations, that is a very strong sign. That is a strong symbol of unity, and it shows that not only are folks unified, that they're willing to take action if they can't get a good deal at the table. So that's obviously something you want to see for a lot of negotiation teams. You'd love to see that kind of momentum heading into bargaining.
If you authorize a strike or you get an agreement, presumably, hopefully, and most of the time, you do get to a contract ratification. You're right to point out that in many sectors, a strike is technically legally not on the table, although we have seen situations in which workers went on strike even though it's technically illegal. Workers in West Virginia and teachers in West Virginia, Massachusetts, places like this have gone on strike and won despite it technically being illegal. The postal workers went on a strike in 1970 despite it technically being illegal, and they were able to win big things. The only illegal strike is one that you lose, as Patco actually said. They're the ones that said that.
They would know it.
Yeah, they would know it. But once you have ratified a contract and finished negotiating and the contract is in place and in force, the last thing that's important to talk about, I think, under how do unions negotiate contracts is contract enforcement. We won't spend very long on it, but, I think it's important to emphasize the fact that you do have to, as a union, enforce the contract. Otherwise, it's meaningless, right?
Right, yeah. I mean, if you don't enforce it, these words don't enforce themselves, right? And certainly if it's something that is advantageous to your members, management is not going to be prone to just go out and do it just because it's in the contract. You have to breathe life into the words of the contract. You have to enforce it day to day. That's going to be the role of your stewards and the role of your rank and file members, educating them on the contract so that they know the benefits in the contract, they know their rights under the contract. That's really important. You have to hold management accountable. You have to be able to show them the language and force them to agree to it and to abide by it. Sometimes that requires filing grievances. And again, that goes back to where we started, because that'll be the beginning of your feedback loop for the next contract. Because if you have a new contract in place and then you start running into issues where maybe the language was a little unclear or the management keeps crossing the line on something, well, that may be where you need to focus some energy in the next negotiations, but certainly in the meantime be filing grievances in between. But yeah, the contracts don't enforce themselves. So, and that's something that even a really good contract, if you're not enforcing it, is not going to live up to its potential. You can get some really great language at the table, but if your stewards are falling asleep at the wheel and not really doing what they're supposed to do, and if members aren't really educated on the contract and enforcing those rights, it's just words on paper.
And we're actually seeing a high-profile example of that with the UAW in Stellantis, where the UAW is threatening a nationwide strike if they don't follow the contract at the end of the grievance procedure, which the UAW has been able to negotiate that at the end of the grievance procedure, at least on this one particular issue, that is decisions that the company makes related to product decisions and investments and things like this, they negotiated the ability to strike over those kinds of things, which is not something that a lot of unions have during the contract. A lot of unions give away totally the ability to strike during the contract term, but the UAW was very dogged about including that right in the contract over product decisions and investment and stuff like that. But yeah, I think that pretty well covers it. The Laborers International Union of North America, LIUNA, Local 366, is proudly recruiting North Alabama local workers to work construction and nuclear plant maintenance. If you're interested, please contact April at our training center to start the process at 256-904-1753. No experience is needed. We offer free training, but you must be able to pass a background check and a drug test. Local hiring that grows our community with good-paying jobs that have benefits is our mission. Live better, work union, Local 366, feel the power. The Valley Labor Report is also supported by the Communication Workers of America. Learn more at cwa-union.org.
Support for this program is provided by the International Association for Machinists and Aerospace Workers, Local Lodge 44 in Decatur, Alabama. Learn more at iamaw44.org.
The Valley Labor Report is also sponsored by the United Automobile, Aerospace, and Agricultural Implement Workers of America, better known as the UAW. They are one of the largest and most diverse unions in North America, with members in virtually every sector of the economy. UAW-represented workplaces range from multinational corporations, small manufacturers, and state and local governments, to colleges and universities, hospitals, and private nonprofit organizations. The UAW has more than 400,000 active members and more than 580,000 retired members in the United States, Canada, and Puerto Rico. You can learn more about the UAW and join at uaw.org. The Valley Labor Report is also sponsored by Labor Notes. Labor Notes is a media and organizing project that has been the voice of union activists who want to put the movement back in the labor movement since 1979. You can learn more about Labor Notes at labornotes.org.
The attorneys at Maples, Tucker, and Jacobs have stood with the working people of Alabama for over 40 years, providing skilled legal representation for your workplace injury claims. When you are injured on the job, it can be a scary time. The attorneys at Maples, Tucker, and Jacobs have the experience to guide you through the process to make sure that you and your family are properly taken care of and your rights are protected. If you need help, call the attorneys at Maples, Tucker, and Jacobs at 855-617-9333 or visit online at www.mtnj.com. No representation is made that the quality of legal services provided is greater than the quality of legal services provided by other law firms.
Support for this program also comes from the Mid-South Council of Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union. Learn more at rwdsu.info.
Union leaders, do you want a powerful website and mobile app built just for your members? The Union Active system, created by Unions America, makes it easy to share news and documents, send alerts, and keep your members engaged anytime, anywhere. Trusted by thousands of unions, Union Active streamlines communication so you can focus on what matters most, your members. With real-time updates, secure messaging, and custom features built for unions, you'll keep your members informed and engaged 24/7. Get Union Active today. Visit unionactive.com to learn more. Union Active, the ultimate website and communication system for unions.
Come on, you poor workers, good news to you I'll tell. How the good old union has come in here to dwell.
And where we're starting today is what to do if you are called into the boss's office. What happens next? What if it's an investigation? What if you're in trouble? The answer will depend on a lot of different variables involved. So if you are a worker, you're called into the boss's office. If you reach out to me, a couple of the first questions I'm going to need to know is, well, where do you work? What kind of workplace is it? Do you have a union in your workplace? Are you a public school employee? Or are you in a non-union private sector workplace? You know, there's different legal frameworks depending on which kind of workplace you're in. So the answers to what to do when you're called into the boss's office is going to largely be based on that, you know, the type of workplace you're in. So for everybody listening, there are things that you can do to protect yourself, and advice that you could also share with your coworkers, regardless of, you know, industry or union representation. But obviously, if you do have union representation, you have more recourse when it comes to a boss asking to meet with you, investigate you, or discipline you. So for those of you in your union workplace, you're in a union shop, you have a union that you're a member of, you get to exercise your Weingarten rights. This is your official right to request representation. In a union environment, your contract is going to determine how much due process you have at work. But when it comes to a disciplinary meeting, if the boss calls you in to ask you tough questions about your performance, you can exercise your Weingarten rights. You can ask that you have the meeting rescheduled or postponed until such a time that your union rep is available. And the employer doesn't get to determine who that representative is, right? It's typically going to be, you know, your steward. But depending on how your union is structured, how your workplace is structured, it could be somebody else. It could be a staffer of the union, or it could be, you know, just a coworker that you go to, frankly. So, you know, to serve as basically like a witness. My background with this is primarily in the public school setting as the local field staffer with the Alabama Education Association. I frequently accompany members in disciplinary meetings and investigatory meetings. Public schools in Alabama have a little bit different rights to that right to representation, which I'll address in a second. But every one of you has some things that you can do. But if you are in a union shop, that's ideal. Have your rep sit in on the meeting. And it's, you know, it's going to help you. It's going to prevent you from digging yourself a hole that you maybe can't get out of. And when I'm talking about being called into the boss's office, the expectation is that like something bad could happen from it, right? If your boss is calling you in for a casual conversation, pick your battles, right? You know, I had some members that had such an adversarial relationship with their supervisor that it got to the point where they didn't want to have any conversation with them without me or another representative present. And, you know, it's a shame that it gets to that point, first of all, but it's also impractical. And in some cases, you know, a boss wanted to just have like a basic conversation, like they needed to relay information to the employee or ask some very basic questions that were not, you know, going to lead to trouble. And so I'll say that you should pick and choose your battles on that. If you're a union member, you've been called into the office and you exercise your Weingarten rights, some people in management may take that as an escalation. They may assume that you've done something or that there's some reason to be suspicious. Of course, we can all say that they shouldn't do that, right? It's your right. You should exercise that right. And to exercise that right is not an admission of guilt or, an admission that you have any reason to be concerned. But, we're talking about human beings, and the reality is that some of those human beings on the other side of the table will take it that way. So, as I mentioned, due process is not exactly going to be the same for every worker. It's going to depend on the contract that you have in your work site. If you don't have a contract, well, then it's going to be based on a collection of laws and, whatever the policies of the company are. But keep in mind, company policies are not set in stone, right? If at-will employment is the default, even if your company has some policies that gives you some degree of, due process above and beyond that, it's not unusual for companies to ignore that policy when they so choose. And you'll find lawyers do not have a lot of success in holding companies to those policies. At least in my experience, certainly in a state like Alabama, where the default judge is going to be pro-employer. So having due process just means that you have some form of procedure and steps that have to be followed before you can be disciplined, whether that's a suspension or, even a full-on termination. So that's different than at-will employment. At-will employment's the default for most workers in most industries outside of a union contract. That is the law of the land in Alabama. At-will employees can be disciplined or fired for any legal reason. And what that means in practice versus theory is important. We can all say that at-will employees can be fired for any legal reason. We can assume that means there are illegal reasons. And that's true, right? Just because you have no due process, just because you're an at-will employee, you cannot be fired for your race, your ethnicity, your gender, your religion, your immigration status, any protected category, federally protected category under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. You are not supposed to be fired for those reasons, right? You're not supposed to be fired for a discriminatory reason. So it's not as if employers just can do literally anything, but in practice, let's say you are fired as an at-will employee and you believe it is discriminatory in nature, right? It's because of whatever identity you have, a category that you fall under. How are you going to prove that? That is the burden of evidence is extreme. I once had a lawyer tell me, in reference to an at-will employee, that the only way he thought the judge would agree it was discriminatory is if the words came up off the page and literally slapped him in the courtroom. That was the only way it was going to happen, right? So unless you have your management on videotape or in an email explicitly saying, we are going to fire this person because they are insert category here, you're going to find you have a very tough time. So you still have your rights. You still have the right to pursue an EEOC charge. And absolutely, if you think something like that has happened, you should. But there's a reason why unions fight so hard to have due process, because it helps to level the playing field. There's just so much room for malfeasance in at-will employment. It gives the employers way too much power. So, that's all context for being called into a meeting. You have to know what your due process is. You have to know that your status, because that's going to help you determine how you respond. If you're an at-will employee, you don't have a union rep, maybe you don't enter that meeting like a bat out of hell, ready to fight, unless you're prepared for what could come next. one thing that you can do, regardless of your employment status, your union status, is in the meeting itself, you, the employee who's being questioned, you can record the meeting. Check your state laws, but in Alabama, we are a one-party consent state. That means only one party to the recording has to consent, and it can be you who presses record. So that was one tip I passed along to my members, like, hey, if I can't be in the meeting with you, you get ambushed, right? Because supervisors love to do those ambush meetings to catch you off guard, to prevent you from talking to your union. You know, if you're caught in that situation, you can record the meeting. Could be very helpful. I recommend taking notes during the meeting. Have out pen and paper, old school. I really, really recommend that for a couple reasons. One, it's important to have notes, and you're going to forget stuff, especially if you are being grilled by your boss. It's going to be a stressful situation. You're not going to remember everything once you walk out that door, right? So taking some notes can help you retain the facts that are relevant and important. And the second thing is that it allows you to help control the flow of the meeting. You can slow it down and say, hold on, let me write this down. I need you to repeat that. Right? You can slow the meeting down a little bit. You can shift the flow of the meeting. And it's not you trying to do anything improper. You're just trying to take your notes. You're just trying to jot down important details. What might you jot down? Well, who is in the meeting? Who all is in the meeting, and what is their title? What is their position? What do they do? Why are they in there? Like that's a very important part of the meeting notes. Your meeting notes should also indicate the time and date of the meeting and where the meeting was held. Was it in boss such and such's office, or was it in the human resources department? Where was it in, a break room? Where did the meeting occur? Those are all very important notes to have. And of course, you're going to want to jot down the best you can the questions that you were asked. You want to be able to keep track of what it was that they were investigating you for, or what it was they were accusing you of. So that's a little bit about your notes and how to proceed with that. When you're in the meeting and you're responding, my advice would be to speak truthfully but concisely. You don't want to lie. You don't want to be dishonest. But you also don't want to share more information than is really necessary. And that can be one of the tripwires, is you get to talking and you start saying more than you probably should. That's why having a rep in your meeting can be very handy, right? Because your rep can, give you the nudge, kick you under the table, give you the signal on the table to pipe down. That is something that if you're by yourself, if you're flying solo, you're not in a union, or you don't have a union rep available, that just takes a lot of self-control. And that's where, again, taking notes can help you, because you're trying to focus on the notes and keeping track of the conversation without letting yourself get too caught up in the conversation. So speak truthfully but concisely. Answer direct questions, but don't volunteer answers to questions that were never asked. All right, that's very important. After you leave the meeting with your boss, it's not over. In fact, it's just started, really, because whatever is to come is still to come from management, whether that's a suspension or termination or further investigation, whatever the situation may be. So when you get done with the meeting, as soon as it is possible, you need to do like an after meeting to-do list. Some of that is going to be finalizing your notes, making sure your notes are in order, making sure you have a copy of those notes. If those notes only exist on pen and paper in that one notebook, you need to type it up. Email it to yourself using your personal email, not your company email. You could also take a picture of the notes. However you do it, Do it, whatever method works for you, but ensure that you have copies of an easily accessible copy of these notes. And the flip side to it is to make sure it's easily accessible to you, not to your management, right? So I strongly advise you don't do this sort of thing through your work email. Your work email does not belong to you. It belongs to work. And so anything of a sensitive nature about your own employment situation or any trouble you may be in, you don't want that discussed on work email. So your after meeting to-do list is you wrap up your notes. If you recorded the meeting, well, then you'll need to go back and do something with that recording. If nothing else, test it out, make sure it did record and the audio is actually usable. Unfortunately, I've had situations where I went in and recorded the whole meeting, but because of the way it was sitting in my pocket or, whatever the space in between the people talking, play the recording and it's just garbage. It's totally unusable. So that's a danger you have if you're relying totally on a recording. Unless you're super, super sure it's going to be high quality and, everything's going to go off without a hitch, you might want to have your backup plan of taking some notes old school. Once you have your notes in order, you have your recording in order, if you have a union, you want to talk with your union about what occurred, right? Whoever your sort of immediate level representative may be in your situation, a steward, a building representative, perhaps it's an officer or a staff member, but you want to talk to your rep about what transpired in the meeting if they weren't there. And you can, of course, provide them a copy of your notes and hold on to that as well. And the most important thing after that meeting, once you've got your notes in order, is to monitor what happens next, right? Because if it's an investigation, there's going to be more to the process. At some point, the investigation will conclude. If it was a disciplinary meeting, do you have a copy of the disciplinary documents that were being discussed? And, where does it go next? Is there a process? What is the process? Did you receive a disciplinary write-up, a written reprimand in the meeting itself? Or is that written reprimand coming at the next meeting, right? That's the sort of thing you gotta just strategize on where you're at on their timeline. And it is their timeline to some degree. You should know what the timeline is in fact, in policy, in law, right? Just like, for example, the 180-day deadline for EEOC cases. You need to know that, and you will be held to any deadlines that are out there. But just know that because a company has a policy that says, we'll respond to grievances in 10 days, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to respond in 10 days, right? And this was certainly the case with the public school district I was working with, where if we missed a timeline, it was definitely a big problem. But if they missed a timeline, what are we going to do? Right? They would just challenge us. They would just see how far they could push it. So I've told you a little bit about what to do when you're in a meeting, how to handle being in meetings with your boss. If you are in a union workplace, you exercise your wine garden rights. That is very important. These rights have been upheld for decades now at this point. If you're not in a union workplace, well, you don't have a rep to go to per se. The classic thing to say when you're exercising your wine garden rights is, if this discussion could in any way lead to my being disciplined or terminated or affect my personal working condition, I respectfully request that my union representative or steward be present at the meeting. Without representation, I choose not to answer any questions. I further request reasonable time to consult with my union representative regarding the subject and purpose of the meeting. I shall not consent to any searches or tests affecting my person, property, or effects without first consulting with my union representative. It is good for you to know that. It's good for you to say that. And many unions have that something to that effect printed on the back of their business cards. If your local does not have information about the wine garden rights, if you don't have that easily distributed to your members, that's something you can put on your to-do list. Whatever committee you're on, whatever role you have in the union, if your members are not getting something that shares their wine garden rights, put that on your to-do list. That's very important. It's very important that your members know the rights that they have on the job and the way in which the union plays a role in enforcing those rights. And so the last thing I'll say on this is that public school employees in Alabama are somewhere in between the totally non-union and the total union dynamics. Public school employees in Alabama have a right to representation, but it is not solidified in law. It is not, as rock solid as the wine garden rights that private sector union members have. It's based on some older case law that, let's just say it's tenuous. And right, so you have to pick and choose your battles, particularly as a public school employee, on your right to representation, because there's only so far you can take it. You absolutely should request a rep. You absolutely should request the meeting be rescheduled to when you can have a rep if the rep's not present. But do know, if you absolutely refuse to have the meeting without your representative, you could be opening yourselves up to an insubordination charge. So that's something you have to keep in mind. If you are a public school teacher in Alabama, you don't have the same wine garden rights that your wife or husband may have at their union shop. You have something like that, but it's not nearly as definitive. And if push comes to shove, you might not win that fight. So keep that in mind. Know your right to request the representation. Exercise your right to request representation. If representation is not available or feasible because of the union status or because of the industry you're in, you can still protect yourself by recording the meeting, by taking notes, by doing some after-meeting homework, and monitoring how management responds. You can still do some protection there. And those notes you need to keep up with, because as you go through your journey, whatever that journey may be and wherever that journey may end, if that journey does end in some form of discipline and some negative consequences for you, those notes from the meeting very well may be the basis for your grievance. It could be the basis for an EEOC charge, an unfair labor practice, whatever the situation may be. So that's a little bit about what to do if you've been called into the boss's office.
We have in studio with us Keith Brower Brown from Labor Notes, Labor and Climate Organizer, and Courtney Smith, Staff Organizer for Labor Notes. Appreciate y'all taking the time to come do a couple of in-studio interviews with us. Really excited to have you down in Alabama. We wanted to do some of the some segments with some of the training that Labor Notes does to give you an idea of what you would experience at a Labor Notes, at a Labor Notes conference or a troublemaker school or something like that. It's such a valuable resource, and really nothing is going to, listening to this or watching this is not going to be able to replace actually going in person, because a huge part of going in person is actually, and this is the dirty secret, not about the training, it's about the networking, right? It's about like meeting people and building relationships. That is a huge part of the training and the value that you get out of it. So you definitely, you should not, absolutely should not listen to this and say, okay, well now I never have to go to a beating apathy workshop, never have to go to building an organizing committee workshop from Labor Notes because I've already heard it, I've already got the value out of it. That is wrong. Do not want you to get that idea. You need to go in person with your coworkers and people in your area, because that is really a huge part of the value. And when you go in person, you're going to get different stories. You're going to get stories that Keith has never heard, that Courtney has never heard, that I have never heard, because there are stories that have never been told before that training that you're going to go to that day, right? So your no two trainings that Labor Notes does are going to be exactly the same, because a lot of the trainings are about learning with the audience and from the audience. And so definitely do not get the idea that like you've got the value out of this, but we want to do what we can and share this with as many people as possible, because it's such a valuable thing. And so this workshop that we wanted to talk through is they call it Assembling Your Dream Team, or Building an Organizing Committee. And so it's not just for like if you're in a new union campaign, obviously, you'll know that you need to build an organizing committee. But even if you are in a currently unionized workplace and you want to build the union into a more fighting union, a more democratic and militant union, you also need an organizing committee. You need a committee. And something that going to several of these trainings with Labor Notes has opened my eyes to a lot, with respect to organizing the workplace in a union sense, is that workplaces are already organized, actually. And so when a Labor Notes trainer says this, Courtney, when you're going to say tomorrow at the workshop, your workplace is already organized, what do you mean by that?
Well, the boss already brings us all together into one place and organizes us in a way that benefits the company. So what we usually do when we're doing this workshop online is I'll take a participant and ask them a series of questions about their workplace. How many different departments do you have? What are the different shifts? What are the different pay scales there? What's the invisible labor? Who can move around the workplace and reach the most people? So you'll find there's a lot of organization already happening that's being done by the boss, right? Which is why they have to actively, disorganize us, is what we talked about in the first session. So the other way that it's also organized is the workers, right? So there's social ways that we organize ourselves. So whether that's, all the smokers who go outside and smoke together, or the parents who get together with their kids after work and, hang out together, or any sports leagues that's happening, or carpools. Yeah, those sorts of social ways that we already kind of organize ourselves in automatically. We ask people to look at that, make a list. Actually, we have folks, if we do this training in person, sometimes we'll get the chance to have folks draw out a physical map of their workplace. And actually visualize how your work is organized. There's a variety of ways that we're already organized and that we just have to kind of tap into that.
Right. And so that, making a physical map of your workplace, why is that helpful? Why is it helpful for me as an organizer to have a map like this for my workplace, Keith?
Helps you see who's connecting between different departments, who's connected in one department or part of the workplace. Who works together is who has to build some kind of relationship with each other. Sometimes that's a trusting relationship. Hopefully, a lot of the time it is. That we have to figure out how to trust each other and work with each other because we're taking care of each other, watching each other's back while we're on the job together. So this is a starting point for building an organizing team. You want to look at it, ideally to find some units that are already out there that are tight, where people trust each other, ready to stand up for each other. But even if you can't find that, you'll find wait, if I'm cutting out the plasma intake department and I don't have anybody on my organizing committee from this big team, then I'm missing out on a huge chunk of the workplace, and the boss is going to use that to divide us.
Right.
So you need to be thinking with some of those things in mind as you're reviewing the map, but also as you are writing it out, be thinking about things like, where people congregate, or like who can walk freely through the whole workplace. Because in a lot of workplaces, you actually there are certain employees that part of their job is just to walk around all the time.
Maintenance,
like internal mail. Like we still have that at my workplace. I don't know how many people do that anymore, but we've got a guy that just walks around. And like that's it, he just puts mail on people's desks, and so like he would be super great to be part of the union and be like really all about it. You could have him send union messages all over the place, and just having that kind of physical representation of the workplace and some of those relationships is really beneficial. And so looking at this, what are some things that I should be noticing in this map as an employee of CSL Plasma?
Where's the supervisor? Where are they watching most often? That's important.
Right.
Do you have any space that's out of view of management? That's a good place to meet and talk to people. Maybe a starting point in this part of the hospital department.
Yeah, I see you've got the cameras are noted here, some of the cameras. And like you said, that intake, you might realize that I don't know anybody in intake. That's a whole huge department here. Courtney, is there anything else that I, as an organizing committee member, or as somebody who's trying to form an organizing committee, should be realizing about this map?
I think one thing that I was just thinking about was like intake here being right next to management. Usually, I'm sure intake, they have to sit still for the majority of their shift. And so making sure that you have a couple of strong people in your intake category here, because management is going to be so close in their ear, really trying to get people on board soon in this organizing process. It looks like the materials and processing here is kind of in a different area and cut off a little bit. So making sure that you're talking to those workers there, and then figuring out where are the places that is out of view of management that you can have these conversations. Like we said earlier, identifying what are those positions that can move freely throughout the workplace, just kind of identifying who do you need to talk to where, and what are the conditions that they're experiencing, and things that you need to look out for.
And then if you're in an already unionized workplace, if you're able to get your hands on the member list, you can actually go through and say, okay, Jane sits here, June sits there, John sits here. And Jane, June, and John, they all sit next to each other in this 4-person kind of cube thing. And there's the 4th person over here, Billy. Billy's not a union member. The 3 of them, one of them should talk to Billy maybe.
Yep.
And you can do some cool color coding and things like that. And when you do that, you're almost certainly in a union workplace going to realize and be able to see like, oh, we're really strong in intake actually. Like if the union members are blue and the non-members are red, we've got 19 blue dots here and only 1 red dot. We're really, really good there. But in materials processing or in donation, we're not so good. We're only like 50-50. So we need to really target donation or something like that. Those are things that can kind of come out of creating this map and using some of the other resources that you might have. And I mentioned having a member list, and something else that you should be creating as you are building your organizing committee and identifying who to target is a list. And you should have a separate list from your official union's member list with some other stuff in it than just, is this person a member or are they not? So as I am trying to build a list of all of my coworkers, what are some of the things that I should include in the list, like pieces of information in a spreadsheet or something, or maybe even just on a piece of paper?
Well, you definitely want to have your assessment of the person. Are they a supporter of the union? Going back to the bullseye example, would you consider them a part of the core, activist, supporter, or disengaged ring? And then that way you kind of know what is the question, what is the level of ask that I can have here. So having that assessment is really important to really know what the strength of your union is. Another thing that's really important to include is what is the issue that this person cares about. If we're going to actually take on issues that our members care about, we have to document what those issues are and the things that they actually care about. That's 2, I think, vital pieces of information that you would want to have on a list. Whatever other information that allows you to have a full kind of assessment of where people are. So maybe how long they've worked there.
What shift they work is
Yeah.
important for when they can meet and who they work with.
Yep.
Yeah.
And maybe if there are any like relationships that stand out, maybe as notable, you might want to make those, right? You know, so I mentioned
BFF with Kathy.
exactly,
Yeah.
or like if we're going back to this 4-person kind of cube here, we've got June, Jane, and John, and Billy's a non-member. Well, what if for some reason the 3 of those people hate Billy, and Billy hates the 3 of those people? Well, we probably don't want the 3 of those people to talk to Billy about joining the union, right? We want to get somebody that Billy doesn't already hate to talk to him, and so it's just another way to kind of understand your coworkers. And so we have, again, in this training, there's a sample list here that includes their name, obviously, the job that they do, the shift that they work, phone number, their email. And this has whether or not they wore a sticker, signed a petition, and attended a meeting. And so what are some things, once you've created this list, that you should be able to identify as an organizer looking at this list and trying to understand your workplace?
I think keeping track of these actions is a really rounded way of getting at the like what layer of the bullseye is somebody in. Are they a supporter or an activist or disengaged? Like you saw they were willing to take the risk of wearing a sticker in front of their manager saying they support the union. That's not nothing. But were they willing to sign a petition, like putting their name on a demand? That's maybe another level. Or were they willing to join a march on the boss or take time out of their evening to come to a union meeting? That's another level of commitment that it's showing. A lot of organizers talk about these as structure tests. You want to see how many people in your unit or in your workplace are willing to step up to these levels. But we want to keep track of it connected to specific people, not just as a number. Oh, we got 60 to do this. We want to keep track of specific people and think of them in this web of relationships in the organization of the workplace.
Right.
Figure out like, wait, intake is like not rising to this. So we need to figure out what will work for them. What are they willing to do? And maybe focus an action that's like working with where they're at.
I also noticed that everybody in the opening shift at least wore a sticker, but the majority of people in the closing shift did not wear a sticker. And so the closing shift, in addition to, like, we can also see that intake is kind of less involved and active than some of the other departments, but the closing shift is also less active than some of the other shifts. And so these are the types of things you will not know, or it is less likely that you will know if you don't write it down or if you don't record this somehow, because the knowledge of the workplace in a lot of situations comes out of doing this work, right?
Part of organizing is we learn through reflection, right? We take an action and then we come back together afterwards and say, well, how did we do? What was the results of that? How many people participated? If we notice that majority of people participated that worked on the open shift rather than the closing shift, then what is it that, you know, the closing shift people care about? What got in their way of participating in this sort of action? So a lot of, you know, kind of this list tracking is a way for us to identify those patterns and see what's working and what's not.
This workshop is geared around building an organizing committee. In this workshop, at least, all of this is all relevant in all facets of organizing, right? You're not only going to refer to your workplace map when you're building your organizing committee. You're also going to be able to refer to it when you're thinking of an issue to build a campaign around. You're going to be able to refer to it for grievance resolution, bargaining surveys, or, you know, any number of things. But this workshop is about building an organizing committee. Let's set these to the side for a moment and just think conceptually about an organizing committee. Keith, what are some of the kinds of people that we don't want?
We're going to talk trash now.
Yes.
A lot of us have a coworker who has a real skill at complaints, you know, who has a lot of gripes and is vocal about them. It can be tempting to think like this person, Steve, has a lot negative to say about the employer. That's a good start. That's some kind of fighting spirit if you're willing to be public with your gripes. But that's not necessarily the same as somebody who's willing to listen to their coworkers and bring people together and look out for them. That's not necessarily... Steve isn't necessarily somebody who's won the trust of their coworkers. So it's not a one-to-one thing. Just speaking up is not a guarantee that somebody is a builder of trust, is a listener, someone who others will follow. And we need leaders in our campaigns, not necessarily elected leaders, not talking about formal positions, but people who are already leaders in the workplace, who have some trust, who others will look to as like, well, if Patricia is willing to do this, she's been here a long time, she's looked out for me, she brought me water on the day, or there's the heat wave, the boss needs her, and like, you know, because she's so important here, if she's willing to take this risk, like I can take the risk too.
You didn't spend very much time on talking about the people that we don't want. You went
Right,
really quickly into the people that we do want. But that's okay. That's okay. There's a real stereotype about union people being kind of lazy or bad at their job or whatever, right? And that's obviously, we know that's not true, but also that is something that you do, that you want to take into consideration when you're building your organizing committee as well, because regardless of what people kind of propagandize about, nobody likes working with somebody who is just objectively bad at their job, right?
Makes your life harder.
Exactly. You're the one that has to pick up slack for this person. And so a person that is actually either objectively or is perceived to be bad at their job, this person is probably going to have a lot of complaints about their employer as well. Probably not somebody that is going to be able to lead a super majority organization. You have to have some amount of trust in your ability to actually be a kind of productive member of the workforce. And so that's somebody that you also don't want. But, enough of that. Courtney, what are some other characteristics that we should be thinking about as we're building an organizing committee? Who should we try to get on our organizing committee?
I think the simplest answer is a leader is somebody who has followers. So whoever's, who's the person that's organizing the birthday parties or the baby showers or the carpools, looking for that person who has those relationships in the workplace. You want someone who's well respected on the job because they won't be such an easy target for management. Surprisingly enough, we usually use talking heads for this one, and there's one talking head who is vying for a position with management and hasn't gotten it yet, and is pissed off about that. And usually most people are like, oh, I would not want her on the organizing committee because that would be, they're anti-union because they're wanting to get a management job. But really, the other side of that coin is that management also knows who our leaders are, and so they'll pluck them as well, right? So somebody who's going for a management position isn't necessarily, you shouldn't just write them off as, a person that wouldn't be good to be on the organizing committee, but, really see them as a potential, they have a potential grievance here against the company, right? So those are also seeing folks who do have those grievances that are pissed off and maybe in the place of feeling like there's nothing that can be done about it. But yeah, having somebody who's like tired of the boss's shit is always a good, something to look for as well. So yeah, what have we got so far? Leader has followers, they're well respected on the job, they've been there for a while, they have relationships with people.
You want to get leaders, and that's what a leader is. And you also want to try to get leaders to the greatest extent that you can that are representative of the workforce too, right? Totally. Like, it would be difficult to lead an organization without anybody going back to our workplace here from intake. Right? There's a lot of people in intake, and if your bargaining committee, your negotiating committee, your organizing committee doesn't have anybody from intake, it's going to be difficult for you to have that kind of perceived legitimacy, but also it's going to be difficult for you as an organizer to know what the people in intake need if you don't have anybody from there. Diversity in kind of all of the senses, right? You don't want an all-white, all-male organizing committee. You also don't want an all-opening shift organizing committee, even if you've got black, white, men, women, gay, straight, immigrant, non-immigrant, but they're all from opening shift. That's not a diverse organizing committee, actually. But the leaders are really the most important thing. And so it's important to think about who the leader is, and some other things that I've heard in Labor Notes workshops about how to identify leaders is like, think about your workplace. What if a problem happens? What if at CSL Plasma, the intake machine broke? Who do you call when the intake machine breaks? Or who do you call when you have a customer, somebody that you're interfacing with that is being belligerent? Who is the problem fixer? That's a good idea of who a leader is. Like you said, who is the one that organizes the happy hours or the birthday cards or the social events and things like that? They are probably leaders. Who does management look to? You mentioned that people immediately kind of discount that person, especially like in labor notes trainings, but it is worth remembering that most people aren't as ideological about this as we are. They don't see being a manager as
the enemy.
Exactly. They just see this
Not
as
yet.
exactly right. We got to, if we get a leader who doesn't perceive it that way, we got to educate them. But a lot of people don't, and so we can't actually, because a lot of, like you said, a lot of people that are leaders are going to be targeted by management to be management. We can't just immediately cast them off because there's a reason that management is targeting them. I literally just had this happen to me somebody in my workplace. There was somebody that was getting more active in the union, and I was like all excited about it. And then he goes and takes a management position. I still love you if you're listening to this program, but you hurt my feelings.
Just say on this point too is that the dominant ideology in America is that the way to improve your conditions is to work your way up the ladder.
Exactly.
So most people don't really see unions as a way for them to improve their conditions. It's all about being the boss, right? How many songs are there where we're talking about being a boss, right? So I don't think we should count those folks out just because they're wanting to improve their conditions. I think that's a good sign that they want things to change. They just think that they need to do it on an individual level instead of collectively.
We've got to prove how that works.
Yeah.
We've got to experience that before it feels real.
Absolutely.
Right. We've got these qualities of what a leader is in our head, and then we're looking over our information, we're looking at the map, we're looking at our lists, and we're thinking through our notes from our organizing conversations that we've had. You need to definitely take notes when you're having organizing conversations. I've been in one training where they recommended like taking notes during the conversation. I don't think that really makes a lot of sense. I think that feels like kind of clinical. Like kind of clinical. You want to So you want to have just enough retention where like immediately you get back in the car and you shut the door and you make sure nobody's looking, and then you bring out the notepad. But you want to take some notes from these organizing conversations, and you're reviewing all of this information, and then you're like, okay, I think that Billy Joe is a leader. I reckon this guy, he's a leader. How do I test that? What do I, we've got a hypothesis now, Keith. What do I do to like see if that's true?
I think the first task of every organizer that you're trying to develop is like, can you talk to other people and like learn something from them? Like see if they're willing to go out and talk to a few coworkers and learn something, and maybe ask those coworkers to do something. So your first ask of somebody is to go and like do the work you're already doing of like having these one-on-one conversations. There may be people who aren't ready for that or like need an alternative, but I think that's really the one we should always be coming back to. That's like everybody's job in this organizing committee or dream team to be talking to our coworkers and bringing them into the action. We're not just like holding on to like the sacred organizing knowledge ourselves.
Right. What happens if you have a leader that you're not able to convince, that is hostile, maybe even belligerently hostile, but they do have followers? How do you organize around a leader?
Talking to an organizer at Amazon at the Bessemer plant when they were trying to organize that, he had shared how there was a leader, a white supremacist leader that was, anti-union and was, or doing his bidding, right? And I mean, I think the way around that is find out who has a relationship with this group or with someone else in this group and talk to them. Who is that next person that you can try and turn and build that relationship with? And it has to be genuine, I think. I mean, I think, like I said earlier with the organizing conversation, people will feel it when you are coming to them with an ask that's not what they want to do. So I think sometimes you have to be patient and you have to wait. The boss is a really great organizer as well. He'll do a lot of good job in pissing people off. So you kind of have to wait for that moment where the boss will do his thing with pissing this group of people off, and you can find your opening.
Exactly. There are a few things that I've heard in these workshops, and there's one in one of Jane McAlevy's books that's really inspiring, and that like I may have almost inadvertently tricked you, because one of the ways is that you don't ever actually count them out. You do organize around them, and you try to talk to the people that they lead. And sometimes there are multiple leaders of the same people, and they lead for different reasons. And so maybe if you've got this anti-hostile leader over here, maybe you have a less hostile or a pro-union leader over here that the same people are looking to, and so you target the other person. But sometimes you do have to kind of do the work of organizing under them, and that's going to be much harder than the leader bringing these people along. You're basically having to kind of snipe their followers, right? But also there are opportunities to even flip hostile leaders. And so in one of Jane McAlevy's books, they're organizing a hospital. There's this, like really, really belligerently anti-union campaigning, like printing off her own signs and stuff like that. Like, and she wins her department. I mean, almost unanimous against the union, but they win the election. And so what the union did in that situation was they went back to this leader and they say, look, we won the election. You're going to be working under a contract that we negotiate. Don't you want to be part of making that happen? And so they recruited this really belligerently anti-union leader to be on the negotiating committee. And through struggle, like we talked about with the packing house workers and in Cleveland and these other stories, this person was transformed into one of the most pro-union advocates. She quotes from some of her Facebook posts, like before the election and then after they got the contract. And, this person called Jane like crying about like how great the contract was and how much the union is such an important, and it's, so there are opportunities, and sometimes you have to wait for them, but you can't ever totally count somebody out, especially like if they are a leader. You do have to be willing, even if they say like really mean things to you, be willing to open the door again.
And I think another point here too is like they may be anti-union, but that doesn't mean they're anti-Courtney, right? So I could develop a relationship with them and kind of keep that door open and build rapport so that eventually when the opportunity does arise, we can return back to, hey, remember that conversation we had about the union? This is why it's important,
Exactly.
I feel like one of the most common versions of this that comes up is not somebody who's hostile to the union, but a union officer who doesn't want direct collective action. And a big purpose of labor notes is to support rank and file union members trying to build reform caucuses when their officers are not supportive of this sort of direct conflict with management. Thinking of an example in the electrical workers, IBEW, someone we know and love who worked with us for a brief time in Seattle, an electrical worker, had a lot of battles with management and with local officers before, built a reform caucus that fizzled out. But through that had like earned some trust and respect from a lot of workers.
Right.
And then there's a really bad wildfire up in the Northwest that was just pummeling this Microsoft huge job site, construction site with smoke. Jorge had like built up enough trust that even though officers didn't want to call off the workday, he called the hall. They were, saying like, you got to wait. Sure, it's dangerous smoke, but we're going to wait. Jorge had built up enough trust of his coworkers to take direct action, essentially, to organize around by like building respect over the years and by like on that morning, talking to a ton of folks on the job site, getting them together.
Right. Now you know how to build an organizing committee, find leaders, make the organizing committee representative. Like I said earlier, a big part of this training over the whole day is the exercise on organizing conversations. And so next time y'all or somebody else from Labor Notes is down in Alabama, we'll try to get y'all in the studio to talk about that. You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project. And you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.